Section 33 of Richelieu, A Tale of France by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, which shows how a king made a reparation and what came of it. While, as we have seen, Chavigny galloped off towards Tarascon, forgetting in the agitation produced by the tidings of Mazarin to take those measures which he had proposed in regard to Villagrande, Cinq-Mars returned directly towards the palace, or rather the house which had been converted into a palace for the king's use. It was one of those old buildings which at that time were common in France, and which even now are often to be met with in cities where the remains of ancient splendour, left alone to the less destructive power of time, have not been demolished by the violence of turbulent times, or the still more inveterate enmity of modern improvement. The whole front, with the two octagonal towers at the sides, and the long corridors on the right and left hand of the court, were ornamented with a multitude of beautiful arabesques and bas-reliefs. These last, the bas-reliefs, entirely covered the principal façade of the building, and offered a number of pictures in stone, representing in some parts battles and triumphs, and in others displaying the humbler and more peaceful subjects of pastoral life and religious ceremonies. Amongst the rest was one medallion which caught the attention of Cinq-Mars, and as the failing light prevented him from seeing it where he stood, he approached to observe it. The chisel of the sculptor, usurping the place of the pencil, had there portrayed a landscape with a flock of sheep pasturing quietly by the side of a brook, while a shepherd appeared sleeping under a hill, down which a wolf was seen stealing upon the flock. Underneath was written in old Gothic characters, Éveillez-vous, le loup s'approche. Cinq-Mars smiled as he read it, applying the warning to himself. Let him come, said he, thinking of Richelieu. He will be caught himself. So saying, he turned, and entering the palace, retired to his own apartments. He had not remained there long, however, before he was once more joined by Fontrailles. Follow me quick, Cinq-Mars, cried the conspirator. The king asks for you. Now is the moment to speak to him. He thinks that his peevishness hurt you this morning, and he is willing to make atonement. It may be well supposed that Cinq-Mars lost no time in following his companion up the great staircase to the king's apartments. It was, indeed, as Fontrailles had said. Since his return, Louis had enjoyed an hour of repose which cleared from his mind the irritability induced by fatigue, and made him reproach himself for the unkindness he had shown to the one so devotedly attached to him as the master of the horse. The remembrance of it oppressed him, and he sent for his favourite, not indeed to apologize, but to wipe away the impression that his irritability had caused, by more than usual kindness and familiarity. The two conspirators found Louis seated in a cabinet which, being placed in one of these towers, partook of its octangular form. The walls were wainscoted with dark carved oak, and even the plafond was all of the same gloomy coloured material, except a massy gilt cornice and projecting rose in the centre, from which hung a single silver lamp, the rays of which, falling on the figure of the king beneath, gave an additional paleness to his worn but fine countenance, and slightly touching upon his plain black velvet suit, shone full on the richly illuminated book in which he had been reading. Louis raised his eyes as Fontrailles entered, and then turning them full on the noble countenance of Cinq-Mars, who followed, a pleased smile beamed for a moment on his lip, and he exclaimed, Well, Cinq-Mars, art thou Nimrod enough to hunt again tomorrow, after our misfortunes of today? Come in, Monsieur de Fontrailles, he continued, seeing that Fontrailles remained near the door, hesitating whether he should retire or not, now that he had done the king's bidding in summoning the Grand Écuyer. Come in, I pray. Sit you down, gentlemen. It is the king's request. You, Cinq-Mars, here. Monsieur de Fontrailles, there is a seat. Now, he continued, glancing his eye round as the light of the lamp gleamed faintly on their several countenances. Now we look like some secret triumvirate met to decide the fate of nations. And that might be, too, replied Cinq-Mars. "Your Majesty to command, and we to execute." The king took no notice, but went on with what he had himself been saying. "There is Cinq-Mars looks like a noble prince, and Fontrailles like a wily minister, and I believe," he continued, laughing, "I have left myself no place but that of secretary." "Alas!" said Cinq-Mars with a deep sigh, "alas, that there should be any man in your Majesty's dominions more a king than yourself." Fontrailles and the king both started, and the conspirator internally pronounced, "All is lost," while Cinq-Mars himself, who had spoken without thought, only felt the imprudence of his speech when it was beyond recall. "Cinq-Mars, Cinq-Mars," cried Louis, "that is a daring speech, but I know it proceeded from your love for me, and therefore I pardon it. But I will tell you that no man is more a king in France than I am." "I crave your Majesty's gracious pardon," replied the master of the horse. "If I have offended your Majesty, it was from love for you alone that I spoke. My words were bolder than my thoughts, and I only meant to say that I could wish to see my monarch show himself that great king which he naturally is. I would fain see the staff of command withdrawn from one who abuses it." "Cinq-Mars," answered the king, "that staff is in my own hand. It was but lent, my friends, and it is now resumed." The master of the horse paused for a moment, not exactly certain how far he could rely upon the king's good humour, which he had already tried so incautiously, and turned his eyes towards Fontrailles as if for counsel. "Speak, Cinq-Mars," said Louis, seeing his hesitation. "Speak boldly and fear not, for I fully believe that all your wishes are for my service, and I would fain hear the voice of those that regard me with affection rather than for their own interest, and one of these do I hold you to be." "Your Majesty does me justice," replied Cinq-Mars. "Let me not offend you then when I say that the power you lent is scarcely resumed while the title under which it was enjoyed remains. The Cardinal Duke of Richelieu, my liege, is still Prime Minister of France. He has still all the power, though not exercised, the revenues, the offices. Our soldiers are fighting at his command. Our provinces are governed by his creatures. Our high posts are filled by his friends. He has an army for his servants, and more than the riches of a prince. Why not, oh, why not, sire, break the enchanter's wand that gave him so much sway, and sweep away the hordes that prey upon the state, like swarms of flies upon a slain deer? Why not direct the operations of your troops yourself, and let the armies of France be the armies of the king, and not of Richelieu? Why not chase from your councils a man who has so often abused the generous confidence of his sovereign, and make him disgorge the ill-gotten wealth which he has wrung from the hearts of your people?" As he spoke, Cinq-Mars grew warm with his subject. His eye sparkled, his arm was extended with that wild and graceful energy for which he was conspicuous. His words flowed uninterrupted, with all the eloquence of enthusiasm, and his fine and princely features acquired a new and striking expression, while, animated in the cause of his country's liberty, he pleaded against the tyrant who had oppressed both king and people. Louis gazed on him at first as on one inspired, but as a host of consequences crowded on his mind, threatening him with 1,000 vague and unsubstantial dangers, he placed his hands before his eyes and remained for some moments in deep thought. "My friend," said he at length, "what is it you would have me do? This man, this bad man, if you will, but still this great man, is like an oak whose roots are deep in the earth. You may hew them asunder one by one, but it requires a giant's strength to pluck the tree up at once. Richelieu's power may be taken from him gradually, but to attempt what you propose would instantly cause a rebellion amongst my subjects. He has so many who depend upon him, he has so many that are allied to him." "What!" exclaimed Cinq-Mars, "shall it be said that King Louis was afraid to dismiss his own minister?" "Not afraid for myself, sir," replied the king, somewhat sharply, "but afraid of bringing the miseries of civil war upon my people." Perceiving that Cinq-Mars was urging the king too impetuously, Fontrailles, who had hitherto remained silent, now joined in the conversation in a soft, insinuating tone, calculated to remove any newly raised irritation from Louis's mind. "All danger, sire," said he, still labouring to quiet the king's fears without opposing his opinion, "all danger which might otherwise be imminent could easily be obviated by commanding the noble Duke of Bouillon." At the name of the Duke of Bouillon, Louis made an impatient motion with his hand. "He is Spanish at his heart," said he. "That Duke of Bouillon is Spanish, rank Spanish. But what of him, Monsieur de Fontrailles?" "Believe me, my liege," replied Fontrailles, "the Duke of Bouillon, whom I know well, is not so much a friend to Spain as he is an enemy to Richelieu. Remember, sire, how he is linked with the Prince of Orange, the sworn adversary of Spain." Louis shook his head doubtingly. "But what of him, Fontrailles? Come to the point." "Only this, sire," said Fontrailles. "The Duke commands an army in Italy devoted to your Majesty's service. But permit me or Cinq-Mars to give him private orders in your name to march them into France, and who shall dare to murmur at your royal will?" "Why, that might be done, it is true," answered Louis. "But I am afraid, mon grand," he continued, applying to Cinq-Mars the term by which he distinguished him in his kindest and most familiar moments, "I am afraid, mon grand, that though thou art a keen huntsman and a good soldier, thou wouldst make but a sorry minister." "I, minister!" exclaimed the Grand Écuyer. "God forbid! No, no, my lord, never did such a thought cross my imagination. Believe me, sire, I had no view of personal aggrandizement in the proposal I submitted to your majesty." "But if you take from Richelieu his office, whom do you wish to substitute in his place?" demanded Louis. "Some one must be minister." "True, my liege, but are there not thousands well fitted for the post?" said Cinq-Mars. "Politicians as deep, but more humane, than Richelieu, men who can govern and yet not tyrannize. I will undertake to find such a one for your majesty, and yet remain myself fully satisfied with being the humble friend of my royal master, and the sincere well-wisher of my native country. But let me order in your name the Duke of Bouillon to march into France, and then, provided with sufficient forces to disarm this usurping minister and overawe rebellion, your own royal will be your only guide." "At present," said Fontrailles, "the king's love for his people operates in two opposing directions, making him anxious to relieve them from the burden under which they groan, yet fearful of throwing a portion of them into rebellion. But by the presence of the duke's army, the minister might be removed without endangering the tranquillity of the realm." "True," said Louis, "true. Monsieur de Fontrailles, you say right." And placing his hand before his eyes, the king thought for a moment, struggling inwardly to exert the powers of his mind, and call up sufficient resolution to deliver himself from the thraldom in which he had so long been held. But dangers and doubts and difficulties swam before his mental vision, like motes dancing in the sunbeam, and never destined in life to overcome his long encouraged inactivity, he strove to cast the responsibility from himself. "Well, well," exclaimed he, "Cinq-Mars, you shall decide it. I will leave the conduct of it all to you. But beware that you do not bring the miseries of civil war upon my kingdom, for be assured that if you do, I will require it of you deeply. It is your own seeking, and the consequences be upon your own head." "Let it be so then, my liege," cried Cinq-Mars, kissing the emaciated hand of the feeble monarch. "It shall not be my fault if France and my sovereign are not soon freed from the cloud that has so long overshadowed them both." "Well, well," said Louis, "we will trust in God for the event. But beware of Bouillon. Cinq-Mars, he is rank Spanish at his heart. And now, gentlemen, to bed, for we must rise in time for our sport. But, in truth, I fear I shall not hunt much longer. The body fails me, Cinq-Mars, though I was once a thing of strength as thou art." End of chapter 9. Section 34 of Richelieu, A Tale of France, by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. How Chavigny rode 50 miles to ride back again. While these schemes for the downfall of his patron were going forward at Narbonne, Chavigny spurred on rapidly towards Tarascon, where the falling minister lay sick both in body and in mind. Besides the personal attachment of the statesman to Richelieu, who had formed his fortunes and led him in the way to greatness, every consideration of his own interest bade him oppose the resignation of the cardinal, which he clearly saw would bring inevitable destruction upon all persons connected with the existing ministry. He had long perceived that a powerful party was forming against Richelieu, especially since his absence and illness gave facility to their operations. All Chavigny's talents and influence had been exerted to oppose them, and that the cardinal would resign his high office he had never suspected for a moment, and therefore the tidings brought by Mazarin came upon him like a thunderstroke, taking from him all faculty of thought but on that one thing. He was well aware, too, that it was no easy task to turn Richelieu from his purpose, and as he rode on, his mind was solely occupied by 1,000 tumultuous and ill-digested plans for preventing the execution of what the cardinal designed. Daylight set in the west, and night fell heavily over the earth without exciting a thought in the bosom of Chavigny, for the irritation of his feelings took away all sensation of bodily fatigue, and almost all attention to external objects, till at length the failing pace of his horse showed him that he, at least, must have rest, and accordingly he paused for a short space at a little village a few leagues from Tarascon, in order to refresh his beast. But even here the agitation of his mind prevented him from seeking any repose himself, and he continued walking up and down before the little auberge for the time that he was thus compelled to remain. It was considerably past midnight when Chavigny arrived at the residence of the minister. On entering the courtyard, all was in darkness, except where, in one spot, a light was seen burning in the chamber of the invalid, and throwing dark across the window the bent shadow of a sleeping attendant. The statesman fastened his horse to one of the iron hooks in the courtyard, and advanced, intending to make himself heard by some one within, but he found that the grooms, grown negligent during their lord's sickness, had left the door unfastened, and pushing it with his hand, it readily gave way. "It is like his fate," thought Chavigny. "While he is ill and sleeping, the gate is left open, and anyone may enter." Passing onward through the hall, he now mounted the grand staircase, lighted by a lamp that had been left to die out as it might, and approached the room where the cardinal lay. The door of the antechamber opened stiffly, but still the drowsy attendant did not awake, and Chavigny passed on into the bedchamber of the cardinal, without anyone being aware of his presence. Were this but known, thought the statesman, how many assassins' hands would now be armed for this one man's destruction? It was Richelieu alone who, lying in feverish restlessness, caught the sound of approaching steps, and there was a sort of intensity in the glance which he fixed on the door communicating with the anteroom, which seemed to say that his judgment of the visitor's purpose was not very favourable. However that might be, whether from the recklessness of illness or from the torpor of one who regards the future as a blank, he took no farther notice of the sound he heard than by fixing his eyes sternly on the door. But the next moment, as the light fell strongly on the face of his friend, the countenance of Richelieu brightened with a smile, and perceiving that Chavigny, who did not see he was awake, approached silently towards the attendant to arouse him, the cardinal pronounced his name in an undertone, and beckoned him towards his bedside. "It is grateful," said Richelieu, as the statesman drew near, "to find that even declining fortunes cannot alienate some hearts. You have seen Mazarin, I suppose?" Chavigny was about to answer, but the sound of the cardinal's voice had awakened the attendant, who was now gazing about in no small alarm, on perceiving a stranger standing by the minister's bedside. Richelieu, however, without showing any anger at his negligence, calmly commanded him to leave them, and as soon as they were alone, Chavigny proceeded: "I have seen Cardinal Mazarin, my lord, and from him I have learned a piece of news which grieves me most deeply. I cannot believe that illness can have so far depressed the spirits of your eminence as to make you entertain the thought of casting from you all those high honours which you have so long enjoyed, and of leaving France in a moment of her greatest peril to be governed by the hands of the weak and the designing." "It is not illness, Chavigny," replied the cardinal, with a melancholy shake of the head. "No, but my day is over. The power has passed from my hands, and it only remains for me to yield the name of it, before that too is taken from me by my enemies." "Pardon me, your eminence," said Chavigny, "but indeed the power is not gone from you. Under whose orders are our enemies fighting? Under whose command is every city and fortress in France? Is it the character of a great man, is it the character of a brave man, to yield all without a struggle, to cast away the sword he has so long wielded, and to give himself bound into the hands of his adversaries?" "Mark me, Chavigny," said Richelieu, raising himself upon his elbow. "Louis is now within the distance of a few leagues. He knows that I am ill, perhaps that I am dying, and yet by no sign of common courtesy does he show that he remembers me. But that was not the beginning. I saw that my power was gone, when he dared, in the face of all the council, to annul the sentence I had passed on that arrogant, stiff-necked Count de Blenau, who had the hardihood to defy the utmost extent of my power." And the minister's eyes flashed with the memory of his anger. "Had your eminence followed my advice," replied Chavigny, "that business would never have occurred. There is that sort of gallant magnanimity about Claude de Blenau which carries all before it, and I felt assured that neither fear nor interest would ever induce him to disclose anything entrusted to his honour. Depend upon it, monseigneur, that it is better not to meddle with such men when we can avoid it." "Well, well, sir," exclaimed the cardinal impatiently, "without doubt you were quite right, and I was quite wrong; but do not teach me to believe that you too, Chavigny, lose your respect for my person when my power is failing." "Pardon me, your eminence," replied Chavigny in a tone of deep feeling. "You wrong me much. Your eminence has been more than a father to me. During the continuance of your power you have always exerted it in my favour, and whether it remains with you or not, my respect and my affection will never fail to follow you in every situation. Believe me, monseigneur, that it is that respect and affection which brings me here even now, to petition that you will waive your intention of—" "Chavigny, it is useless," interposed the cardinal. "I have only the choice left to yield it of my own free will, or to have it wrenched from my unwilling hand. Judge which is the wisest, judge which is the best." "Were that certainly the case," said Chavigny thoughtfully. "It is certainly the case," replied the minister. "There are many, many combined against me. Singly they are but reeds, and one by one I will break them like reeds; but united together, and with the king at their head," and he shook his head despairingly, "they are far too strong either for you or me." "But could no means be found to separate them? Bethink you, monseigneur, avarice, revenge, ambition, might sow the seeds of discord amongst them, and give them like sheep into our hands." "It is too late, my friend," replied the cardinal. "It is too late. Had I foreseen it, I might have prevented their combining. I might have crushed some and bribed others, destroyed the powerful and overawed the timid. But it is now too late." "But whom does your eminence think particularly implicated?" demanded Chavigny. "Oh, there are many, many, many," replied Richelieu, withdrawing the thin pale hand he had stretched over his face as he finished the last desponding words, "too late," probably desirous of hiding the emotion produced by the conviction that his power was irretrievably gone. However, when that hand was removed, his countenance showed no traces of any remaining agitation. "There are many, Chavigny," he said. "There are Vendôme and Bouillon, and noisy Beaufort, and turbulent Gaston of Orleans, and witty Marsillac, and cool, moralizing de Thou, who has so often dared to pry into my actions and condemn them. And there is, above all, sly Fontrailles, and Cinq-Mars, whom I—" "Ha!" exclaimed Chavigny, as the cardinal's words recalled to his mind the conversation between Cinq-Mars and Fontrailles. "I had forgot, like an idiot I had forgot. and he struck his clenched hand violently against his brow, as if he sought to punish his own folly. "But it is not yet too late," he cried. "It is not yet too late." "Forgot what, Chavigny?" demanded the cardinal, seeing with astonishment the emotion which was called up in his friend by the remembrance of so great an oversight. "Forgot what? Too late for what? What is it moves you so deeply?" "Pardon me, your eminence," replied Chavigny. "I have no time to explain, only I have to ask two favours. The first is, that you will let me take a stout horse from your stables. Mine will go no farther. The next," he added in a tone of greater composure, but still one of earnest entreaty, "the next is, if you had ever a regard for me, if ever I served you well and faithfully, that you will promise me to take no step in the business we have spoken of till my return, which shall be before tomorrow evening." "It can make but little difference waiting till that time," answered the cardinal. "But what is the matter, Chavigny? What is it agitates you thus?" "Have I your promise, monseigneur?" asked Chavigny quickly. "You have," said Richelieu. "Out of regard for you, and solely because you ask it, I will suspend my resolution till your return." "Well then, God protect your eminence till we meet again," exclaimed the statesman. "I go upon your service, and if I do not succeed, I care not how soon my head shall be brought to the block, as a just punishment for my mad forgetfulness." Thus saying, he quitted the room, and descending to the stables, called up the grooms whose sleepy movements ill accorded with the rapid emotions of his bosom. Now the stirrups were not long enough, then the girths had to be buckled tighter, then the bit was mislaid, and then the crupper could not be found. At length, however, the horse was fully prepared, and calling for a cup of wine, Chavigny drained it to the bottom, and galloping out of the court, was soon once more on the road to Narbonne. But it was in vain that he used the whip and spur to arrive at that town before the hour appointed for the Italian's departure. Ere he had measured half the way, the day rose bright over the hills before him, and clenching his hands, he exclaimed in the bitterness of disappointment, "Too late! I am too late!" Still, however, he went on at full speed, hoping that by sending out couriers in every different direction he might yet overtake the messenger. Every one who has ridden from Tarascon to Narbonne must remember the picturesque beauties of that part of the country. At the spot where Chavigny had now arrived, high rocks breaking forth from a thick covering of wood skirted his way on each side, and having ascended to the top of the hill, an immense valley lay before him, scattered with forests and broken into 1,000 inferior ridges, some of which bore upon their summits the steeple of a village church, some the ruins of those ancient towers which had been erected in days gone by to defend the passes from the neighbouring Moors of Spain. At his feet thin waves of white mist floated in the morning light, partially obscured the road he was going, till, rising out of the trees, it was seen winding along the mountains on the other side. Chavigny paused for a moment to trace its direction, and as he did so, his eye fell upon the figure of a single horseman, descending into the valley from the opposite hill. "Whom have we here?" thought the statesman, not without a faint hope that it might be the person he sought. Spurring on his horse, however, he rode forward to meet him; but on reaching the bottom of the descent, the figure he had seen from above became hidden by the windings of the road amongst the trees, and Chavigny's heart fluttered lest the horseman, whoever he was, might have taken the other road, which turned through the valley to the left. At length, however, the sound of a horse's feet was heard approaching quickly towards him, and certain that he must now pass that way, the statesman drew in his rein and stood with his eye intently fixed upon the spot where the road verged into the forest. As there was still a considerable descent from the spot where Chavigny paused to the bottom of the valley, the sound was heard for a long time, coming nearer and nearer, before anyone appeared. At length, however, the horseman came in sight, presenting to the glad eyes of the statesman the identical figure of the Italian, Villagrande, with his long sword, extensive moustaches, and a pair of heavy pistols at his saddle-bow. Chavigny doubted not that to possess himself of the papers which the Italian carried would require a desperate struggle, but without a moment's hesitation he drew his sword, and galloped on to attack him. No sooner had Villagrande perceived a stranger on the road before him than he reined in his horse. But now, as Chavigny rode on full speed towards him with a menacing attitude and drawn sword, the Italian, in his terror, conceived at once that it was a robber, and throwing himself to the ground in mortal fear, he fell on his knees, exclaiming, "I will give it you all, every ducat, only spare my life." "Rise, rise, cowardly villain," cried Chavigny, catching the bridle of the Italian's horse, which was starting away with a wild toss of the head, as the statesman rode up. "Rise, Sir Poltroon, do you not know me?" "Know you? Know you?" exclaimed Villagrande, gazing wildly at Chavigny. "Oh, Monseigneur, is it you? How you frightened me!" But Villagrande, who had trembled sufficiently when he thought it was a robber, trembled 10 times more than ever as he recognised the statesman, and he could scarcely find strength in his knees to raise himself from the ground. "Rise, sir," exclaimed Chavigny impatiently, "and instantly give me the treaty." "Treaty?" cried Villagrande, still trembling, but endeavouring to put on a look of astonishment. "What treaty does Monseigneur mean? I know of no treaty." "Lying slave!" exclaimed Chavigny, striking him with the flat side of his sword. "If you do not produce it within 10 seconds of time, by heaven I will cut it out of your base cowardly heart." "But if I do," said the Italian, seeing that there was no escape left. "Come, sir," cried the statesman, "no buts for me. If you stand shuffling 1 minute more, I will run my sword through you, and search for it on your carcass myself." "Well, well, Monseigneur, I see you know it all, and therefore it will be no stain on my honour if I give it to you." "Honour!" cried Chavigny with a scoff. "Come, sir, the treaty." Villagrande approached his horse, and raising the flap of the saddle with shaking hands, drew forth, from a pocket concealed in the padding, a large paper sealed in an envelope. Chavigny caught it eagerly from his grasp, and running his eye over the address, he read, "To Monseigneur the Duke of Bouillon, Commander-in-Chief of all the armies of France warring in Italy." "Ha!" continued the statesman, "this is not the road to Italy. What brings you here?" And he turned towards Villagrande. But while the statesman's eyes were fixed upon the paper, the wily Italian had begun to creep towards the wood. Chavigny, however, perceiving his design, caught one of the pistols from the horse's saddle-bow, and pointing it towards the fugitive, soon brought him back again. "Stand you there, sir," said he. "Now tell me what makes you here, when this packet was intended for Italy." "Why, Monseigneur, why, to tell the truth, there was another little dispatch to be delivered to the frontiers of Spain. Here it is." And diving into a deep pocket in his doublet, he produced a packet smaller than the other, and gave it into Chavigny's hand. "And now, Monseigneur, I have freely discovered all I know," continued Villagrande. "I hope that you, Monseigneur, will promise me your protection, for if the other party get hold of me, they will murder me to a certainty." Chavigny made no answer, but without any ceremony broke the seals of the 2 packets, and passing his horse's bridle over his arm while he read them, he opened the treaty, and turned to the list of names by which it was signed. In the meanwhile, Villagrande kept his eyes fixed upon him, watching for a favourable moment to escape, if the statesman's attention should be sufficiently engaged to allow him so to do. "Ah, here I have them fairly written," proceeded Chavigny, speaking to himself. "Philip the Most Catholic, Olivares, then follow Gaston of Orleans, Cinq-Mars Grand-Écuyer, Fontrailles," and a space for Bouillon, of course. "Now, let us see the letter to the noble Duke." And he opened the one which he found in the same packet with the treaty. But as he read, his eye fixed with painful earnestness upon the paper, and the colour fled from his cheek. "God of heaven, what is this?" said he, reading, "though I doubt not, my noble friend, that after all which has lately passed, you will put your forces in motion at my simple desire. The king's command is yet higher authority, and that I now send you to march with all speed to the frontier, embarking 5,000 foot at Porto Longone, to land at Marseilles. All this, in case the friends and adherents of Richelieu should attempt to make head against the royal authority." All is lost, muttered Chavigny, but let us see the whole at least, to provide for our own safety. And he again turned to the paper, which proceeded: I send you the treaty with Spain for your signature, which is especially necessary to the article relative to your principality of Sedan. The troops of His Catholic Majesty are on the frontier, ready to march at our command, but I have been obliged to conceal from the king our Spanish connection, as his hatred to that country is as great as ever. I have you, Monsieur Cinq-Mars, exclaimed Chavigny, clasping his hands with joy. This treaty is your death warrant, or I know not King Louis. Italian scoundrel, he continued, turning to look for Villagrande. Ha! The slave has escaped. That must not be. He were the best witness in the world against them. And springing from his horse, he tied him to a tree together with that of the Italian. While Chavigny had been reading, with all his attention fixed upon the paper, and all his passions excited by its contents, Villagrande, watching his moment, had crept gradually to the edge of the wood, and darted into a narrow path half covered with branches. But though the way he had taken was thus, in a degree, concealed, it did not escape the quick eye of the statesman, and as the motions of the Italian, till he had got into the wood, had been necessarily cautious, in order not to call his attention, Chavigny, following as fast as lightning, soon caught the sound of his retreating footsteps, reverberated from the rocks around. As he advanced, he called loudly to the Italian to stop, and that he should have a free pardon. But Villagrande, trusting to the distance that was still between them, and hoping, if he could elude immediate pursuit, to be able to escape into Spain, continued running on, while Chavigny as perseveringly followed, threatening and promising by turns, but alike without effect. At length the strength of the Italian, already diminished by fear, began to fail entirely, and Chavigny found that the distance between them was rapidly lessening, when in a moment the sound of footsteps, which had hitherto guided him, ceased entirely. A cry of agony reached his ear, and running still more quickly forward, he, too, had nearly been precipitated over the edge of a steep crag, which, in the hurry of his flight, the unhappy Italian had not noticed. The statesman's first impulse was to start back, for he was on the very brink of the precipice before he was aware. But soon recovering himself, he approached the edge, and looking over, beheld the mangled form of Villagrande lying on some rough stony ground at the bottom of the rock. God of heaven! cried Chavigny, what a fool! The poor wretch must surely be dead. However, he must not lie there, for the wolves will soon be at him. And looking around, he sought for some way to descend the rock. It was a considerable time before he could accomplish his object, but at length he succeeded, and on arriving at the spot where Villagrande lay, he found that the Italian, in his flight, had taken a diagonal path through the forest, which cut off a large bend in the main road, and joined it again by a zigzag path down the rock at some distance. Thus the spot where Villagrande was then lying was about half a mile from the place at which he had first been encountered by Chavigny, if the high road was followed. But by the path through the wood the distance could not have been more than a few hundred yards. Chavigny's first care was to examine the body of the Italian, who was so entirely deprived of sense that at first the statesman believed him to be dead. But in a moment or two some signs appeared which led him to conclude that life was not completely extinct, and taking him in his arms he carried him to the spot where the horses stood. Here he placed him on the stout black hunter which Cinq-Mars had lent, and led him slowly to a small town about a mile farther on the road. It has been already stated that hardly was there a village so small in the whole extent of France as not to be furnished with one or more of those agents of Richelieu's minute policy, whose principal duty consisted in communicating everything that passed around them to another class of superior agents, and also to facilitate all the secret operations of government in the sphere ascribed to them. The actual pay received by these men was but small, but the favour shown to them on all occasions, and the facilities afforded to them in their more ordinary employments, put them above competition, while others in the same class, and amply rewarded them their private services, for it must always be remembered that their connection with the government was held as a profound secret, and consequently they always were seen to exercise some open trade, which in most cases prevented their less ostensible employment from being even suspected by their neighbours. It was to the house of one of these inferior agents that Chavigny led the horse charged with the senseless body of Villagrande, and having commanded that he should be taken in and placed in bed, he himself aided in endeavouring to recall him to life, partly from the natural humanity of his disposition, partly from those political considerations which were ever paramount in his mind. Villagrande, if he could be restored, would prove, Chavigny knew, too excellent a witness against the conspirators whom he had served, to permit of his life being lightly cast away, especially as it was evident that either fear or bribery would induce him to confess anything. But even had it not been for this reflection, the statesman's natural disposition would probably have led him to succour the unhappy man, in whose misfortune he had been so greatly instrumental. After many efforts, Villagrande once more began to evince that the vital spark was not yet extinguished, and having so far succeeded, Chavigny, upon whose mind 1,000 subjects of deep import were pressing every moment for attention, gave directions to the agent we have already mentioned to show every attention to the wounded man, and to keep him for that day at his own house, which was situated a quarter of a league out of Limoux, but as soon as night came, to have him privately removed to Corneille, at which place a surgeon could be more easily procured from Carcassonne, and having reiterated the most strict injunctions to keep the whole business profoundly secret, lest the conspirators should learn the fate of their envoy, and take their measures accordingly, Chavigny once more turned his steps towards Tarascon to recount to Richelieu the events of the day. End of chapter 10. Section 35 of Richelieu, A Tale of France by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, which was written expressly to prove that there is many a slip between the cup and the lip. It was the small chapel of St. Catherine, otherwise called the Queen's Chapel, attached to the palace church of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, to which Poitiers, Bishop of Beauvais, proceeded with slow steps from the door of private communication with the château, on a night in October 1642. He was preceded by 2 young abbés, carrying lighted tapers, and followed by a group whose white garments spoke that they came on some occasion of joy. The first of these was Anne of Austria, with her eyes animated and her countenance glowing with the interest she took in everything which bore the least appearance of secrecy or romance. Her right arm was passed through that of the Marchioness de Beaumont, who moved on with a calm, rather grave countenance, while on the Queen's left walked a young lady in the first gay spring of life, ever and anon turning a smiling, playful glance behind to Pauline de Beaumont, who, leaning on the arm of Claude de Bernau, followed, agitated, blushing, and happy, towards the altar at which they were to be united for ever. Seguin, the Queen's physician, and Henri de la Motte, the Count's page, were admitted as witnesses to the ceremony, and an attendant was stationed at the door to guard against any troublesome devotee entering the church during the time it was thus occupied. The idea of marrying Pauline de Beaumont privately to the Count de Blenau had entirely originated with the Queen, whose passion for anything romantic often threw both herself and her friends into situations of great danger. In the present instance, she represented to Madame de Beaumont that 1,000 circumstances might occur in those unhappy times to tear de Blenau again from her he loved, or that the cardinal might positively prohibit their marriage, and then, she asked, who would dare to oppose him, whereas their private union would obviate all difficulties and incur no danger. Madame de Beaumont made many objections, and her daughter hesitated, But the wishes of the queen overcame all the marchioness's scruples, and the entreaties of de Blenau were not less powerful with Pauline. The appointed night being arrived, and all the arrangements having been made as privately as possible, Pauline, as we have said, followed her mother and the queen into the chapel of St. Catherine. But, as she did so, there was a sort of despondency fell upon her that she could not account for. As she leaned upon de Blenau, she felt that she was most happy in being united to him. She was agitated, it was true, but still it was natural that she should be so, she thought. All her duties, all her ideas were, by one single word, about to suffer an entire change, yet that did not take from her happiness. But still there was an undefined fear, a sort of melancholy presentiment, which weighed upon her spirit she knew not why. She asked herself, was de Blenau less kind? Oh no, and as the thought passed through her mind, she raised her eyes for a moment from the ground on which they had been bent, and turned them on her lover. In so doing, they met the full, soft, affectionate gaze with which de Blenau was at that moment regarding her, and a deep blush rose in her cheek, but soon faded away, and left her pale again and thoughtful. She had not, however, much time to analyse her feelings, for by this time the bishop had reached the altar, and waited their approach. Potier, Bishop of Beauvais, had little of that gentleness of disposition or suavity of manner calculated to reassure Pauline. He had undertaken the office which he came there to fulfil, merely at the desire of the queen, and that not without making considerable opposition. But though Potier was obstinate, Anne of Austria was still more so. She had resolved that the ceremony should be performed, and that he should perform it, and she carried her point. But yet he made his dislike to the task very apparent, and regarded the innocent Pauline with no very friendly looks. "Come, mademoiselle," said he, as Pauline seemed to linger for a moment, "you and Monsieur le Comte will have enough of each other's society after my office is over. Let us proceed with the ceremony." The group arranged themselves round the altar, and the bishop, opening the book, began to read. The promise, which was to bind her to de Blenau for ever, trembled on Pauline's lips, when a confused noise at the private door leading to the palace caught her ear, and she paused. De Blenau, who had not heard it, turned towards her in surprise. But immediately the voice of the attendant, who had been stationed there as porte-greve, was heard exclaiming to someone, who apparently endeavoured to make his way into the church, "Stand back, I say. You do not enter here. What is your authority?" "My authority," replied another voice, "is a warrant of council. Oppose it if you dare. Strike him down if he does not let you pass." And immediately the door bursting open, an officer of the cardinal's guard, with a file of soldiers, entered the church. "Guard the doors," cried the officer, "and let no one quit the place." And giving his partisan to one of the soldiers, he advanced towards the high Gothic arch, forming the boundary between the main aisle and the chapel of St. Catherine. Pauline clung to de Blenau. "Oh, Claude," cried she, "they are going to tear you from me again. My heart misgave me. I was sure that something dreadful would interpose between us." De Blenau whispered a few words of comfort to her, and Potier himself was moved by her agitation. "Do not be afraid, on sacred ground. Stop, sir," he continued, advancing to the steps of the chapel, which the officer had just reached. "What seek you here, and how do you presume to bring armed men into this church?" "I come, sir," answered the officer, "with a warrant from his Majesty's council to arrest Claude Count de Blenau," and he made a step towards the chapel. "Hold!" exclaimed the bishop. "You arrest him not here. This ground is sanctuary, and I command you in the name of God and our holy religion to withdraw your men, and instantly to quit this church." And he waved his hand with an air of dignified authority. The officer paused. "But, monseigneur," he replied, "the count is charged with high treason." "With high treason!" exclaimed the queen. "With high treason!" echoed Pauline, clinging still closer to de Blenau's arm, which she had encircled by both her own. "He is charged with high treason," repeated the officer, "and I must fulfil my duty." "Were he charged with all the crimes which disgrace humanity," replied the bishop, "here he is sanctuarized, and I command you, on pain of excommunication, you, sir officer, and your soldiers, to quit the church. I stand not here to see this altar violated, whatever be your authority." The officer paused a moment, uncertain how to act. "Well, Holy Father," replied he at length, "I obey, but I shall take especial care to guard every door of the church, so that if there be any blame, it does not fall on me." And muttering between his teeth the discontent he did not dare to vent aloud, he slowly withdrew his men. The eye of Anne of Austria watched them intently till the last soldier had passed through the door which communicated with the palace. Then, turning quickly to the Count, she exclaimed, "Fly, quick, de Blenau, up that staircase, cross the Joube, through the monk's gallery round the choir. You will find a door on the right that leads to the king's cabinet. Wait there till I send. Quick, fly, I desire, I command you." "Oh, fly, Claude, fly," reiterated Pauline. "They will murder you surely this time, if you do not fly." "Pardon me, your majesty, pardon me, dear Pauline," replied de Blenau. "It cannot be. There is no man in France more innocent in deed, word, or even thought, of treason against his king and country than I am. And Claude de Blenau flies from no one, so long as his honour and integrity remain by him. When these fail, then he may become a coward; but to these I will now trust, and instantly surrender myself to his majesty's warrant. I did not interfere while Monseigneur defended the rights of the sanctuary, for he did but the duties of his high office, nor indeed was I willing to yield my sword to a servant of Cardinal Richelieu. Take it and keep it for your master." "De Blenau, you are an obstinate man," said the queen. "I will urge nothing, but look at this pale cheek, and fancy what the feelings of that sweet girl must be." And she pointed to Pauline, who stood by with the tears chasing each other down her face. As she spoke, there had been many a bitter pang struggling in de Blenau's breast. The appeal of the queen, the sight of Pauline's distress, overcame his calmness, and starting forward, he caught her in his arms and pressed an ardent kiss upon her lips. "Dear, dear Pauline," he exclaimed, "all will go well, be assured. My innocence will protect me." Pauline shook her head mournfully, but her heart was too full to reply. "Then you will not fly?" demanded the queen, with some degree of impatience. "He is in the right, madam," said the bishop. "As a good subject, he is bound to obey the laws of his country, and in duty to himself he ought not to give weight to the charge against him by seeming afraid to meet it." Anne of Austria turned away with a look of angry disappointment. "Well, at all events," said she, "let us conclude the ceremony which has been thus interrupted, and afterwards the Count can act as he pleases." De Blenau hesitated. He felt that what the queen proposed, if carried into effect, would be the only consolation he could receive under the new misfortune that had befallen him; but he felt also that it was a selfishness to wish it, and he looked towards the bishop, who had so well supported his first resolution. But Potier bent his eyes gravely on the ground, disapproving the proposal, yet unwilling farther to oppose the queen. "It shall be as Pauline decides," said de Blenau, taking her hand and raising it gently to his lips. "Pauline," he continued, "you know how deeply I love you. You know how I have longed for the hour that should give me your hand; but I fear that I should be cruelly selfish were I to ask you to become the bride of one whose fate is so uncertain. Speak, dear Pauline." Mademoiselle de Beaumont spoke not, but she raised her eyes to de Blenau with an expression which told that every feeling of her heart was given to him. The marchioness, however, interposed. "No," said she, "Claude, you are right. It is better to wait. The time will come, I feel sure, when you will be able to claim Pauline in the midst of smiles and happiness, instead of tears and danger. Does not your majesty think this delay advisable?" "My opinion has been expressed already," replied Anne of Austria peevishly, "but it is not my affair. Act as you think fit. But were I Pauline, and my lover gave me up so calmly, I would seek another in his absence to console me." De Blenau, deeply hurt, bit his lip, and by a strong effort forced himself to silence. But Pauline placed her hand in his, and raising her eyes to his face, "Fear not, Claude," she said. "In life and in death I am yours. None other shall ever possess the hand of Pauline de Beaumont." "You are a noble girl, Pauline," exclaimed the Queen. "De Blenau, I was wrong, but it vexes me to see that you will always be more in the right than I am. Do not look so sad, Pauline. The more I think of it, the more I feel sure that de Blenau's innocence will stand him in good stead yet, and I begin to reckon also somewhat on my own influence with Louis. He is far kinder than in former days, and I will make a point of earnest prayer that de Blenau be fairly used. Besides, they have now no plea against him. There are no secret letters to be discovered, no correspondence with the public enemy." Pauline shook her head mournfully. A cloud had come over the sun of her days, and she fancied that he would never beam brightly again. "If we could ascertain the reason for this arrest," said Madame de Beaumont, "it might in some degree satisfy our minds." "That may be easily done," replied the bishop, "as Monsieur de Blenau is resolved to surrender himself. We can question the officer in regard to what occurred at the place from whence he comes, and by that means discover what circumstances have arisen to cast suspicion on the Count." What the bishop proposed was instantly agreed to, and de Blenau sent forward his page to inform the officer of his determination. Anne of Austria then took a few steps along the nave, and turned to see if he still held his resolution. De Blenau bowed. "I follow your majesty," he said. "I feel that I have nothing to fear." And they passed on slowly and sadly to the other end of the church. As they went, Pauline still clung to the arm of her lover, as if she feared that every moment they would tear him from her, and tear after tear rolled silently down her cheeks. The heart of de Blenau was too full for words, so that silence hung upon the whole party. At the door which communicated with the palace stood the cardinal's officer with 2 or 3 of his men, and as she approached, the Queen desired him to follow her to the saloon. The officer bowed low and replied that he would obey her commands, but immediately advancing to de Blenau, he laid his hand upon the Count's arm. "In the King's name, Monsieur le Comte de Blenau," said he, "I arrest you for high treason. Behold my warrant." Pauline recoiled with a look of fear, and de Blenau calmly put the man's hand from off his sleeve. "Pass on, sir," he said. "I am your prisoner." The officer hesitated. "Pass on, sir," repeated the Count. "You have my word. I am your prisoner." The man passed on, but not before he had made a sign to the soldiers who were with him, who suffered the Count and Pauline to pass, and then, closing in, followed at a few paces' distance. On reaching the saloon, the Queen took her seat, and beckoning to Pauline, who, faint and terrified, was hardly able to support herself, she made her sit down on the footstool at her feet. "Now, sir officer," said Anne of Austria, "what news bring you from Narbonne? How fares his Majesty the King?" "May it please you, madame," he replied, "I come not from Narbonne, as your Majesty supposes, but from Tarascon, where the King had just arrived when I departed." "The King at Tarascon!" exclaimed Anne of Austria. "In the name of heaven, what does he at Tarascon?" "That is beyond my knowledge," answered the officer. "All I can tell your Majesty is, that for the last week there has been strange flying of couriers from one place to another. Monsieur de Chavigny was almost killed himself with riding between Tarascon and Narbonne. Everything is altered evidently, but no one knows how or why. And just as Aleron, Monsieur de Brezet's maître d'hôtel, was about to give me the whole history, I received an order to set off from Paris instantly, and when I arrived there to take 20 troopers from the caserne, and come on hither on the errand which I have the honour to perform." "But did you hear nothing?" demanded the Queen earnestly. "Did this Aleron tell you nothing?" "Nothing, madame," replied the officer. "He had just made me promise inviolable secrecy, and we were interrupted before he began his tale, or I would have told your Majesty with pleasure." "But from report?" said the Queen. "Did you gain no knowledge from rumour?" "Oh, there were rumours enough, truly," answered the man; "but as fast as one came it was contradicted by another. Some said that the troops at Perpignan had revolted, and some that Monsieur le Grand had killed Cardinal Mazarin. Others brought word that Monsieur de Noailles had tried to poison the king, and others that the king had kicked Fontrailles for hunting in short boots. "Nonsense," said the queen, "all nonsense. It is unfortunate," she continued, musing, "that we can get no information. But tell me, where are you ordered to conduct Monsieur de Blenau? To the Bastille?" At the name of a place where both de Blenau and herself had suffered so much, and which was associated in her mind with every horrible idea, Pauline clasped her hands over her eyes, as if to shut out the frightful visions it recalled. "No, madame," replied the officer. "I am commanded to conduct Monsieur de Blenau as quickly as possible to Tarascon, and allow me to remind your majesty that the time is passing fast." De Blenau made a sign to the officer indicating that he was ready. He saw that Pauline's hands still covered her eyes, and wishing to spare her the pain of such a parting, he bowed profoundly to the queen, and moved in silence to the door. The queen and Madame de Beaumont saw his intention and remained silent, but as he reached the door he could not resist the desire to turn and look once more upon her whom he was leaving, perhaps for ever, who had so nearly been his bride, whom he had loved so long, who had undergone so much for him. It was excusable, but the delay defeated his purpose. The sudden silence alarmed Pauline. She raised her eyes. She saw de Blenau in the act of departing, and the last fixed painful glance with which he regarded her. All but her love was that moment forgotten, and starting wildly forward, she threw herself into his arms, and wept bitterly on his bosom. But Madame de Beaumont, advancing, gently disengaged her from his embrace. Pauline hid her eyes upon her mother's shoulders, and de Blenau, with a heart ready to break, fled quickly from a scene that his fortitude could support no longer. End of chapter 11. Section 36 of Richelieu, A Tale of France, by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Which shows that a man who has climbed a mountain may stumble at a pebble, or the consequences of one oversight. We must once more go back to Narbonne in order to explain the events which had there taken place since the day on which Chavigny possessed himself of the treaty with Spain. Cinq-Mars, hearing nothing of his agent, of course concluded that he was quietly pursuing his way; and willing to take every precaution to ensure the success of his plans, he spent the next day in riding over to the camp at Perpignan, and endeavouring to ingratiate himself with the officers and soldiers of that part of the army. The splendour of his train and equipage, the manly beauty of his person, the dexterity in all warlike exercises, and the courteous familiarity of his manners, attracted all eyes and won all hearts, and Cinq-Mars, well contented with the day's success, did not return to Narbonne till very late at night. The next morning had been appointed for hunting, but that day the king was rather later than usual, and Cinq-Mars, as he waited in the saloon till Louis should be ready, took up a romance which some of the pages had left behind, and stretching his tall, elegant form at length in the window-seat, he began reading to pass the time. The book was the true history of Don Cleofar of Castile, and as Cinq-Mars read on, he became interested in the fate of the hero. He had opened the volume at that part where the knight rescues Matilda from the power of the Moors. He was in the act of persuading her to descend the staircase in the tower, at the foot of which the repentant renegade waited with their horses, and Cinq-Mars, whose whole heart was full of romance, at one moment entered entirely into the vehement and almost angry arguments of Don Cleofar, and then again felt for the alarm and doubt of the timid Matilda. So much indeed was he occupied, that as some one passed to and from the king's chamber, he scarcely raised his eyes to notice who it was, and when at last he did so, he found it was only a page. The tale went on, and his eye ran from sentence to sentence, to see if the fears of Matilda had proved fatal to their hopes of escape, and his heart beat with anxiety and alarm as the wind blew the door to behind them, and they listened to hear whether the Moors had been awakened by the sound. It was at that moment that another step met his ear, whose firm, decided pace plainly told that it was not that of a domestic. Cinq-Mars raised his eyes, and as he did so they encountered those of Chavigny, who was passing on to the apartments of the king. Chavigny bowed with a peculiar smile. Cinq-Mars returned his salutation, and again began reading his book. "It is all over with your power, Monsieur de Chavigny," thought the master of the horse. "I will but read out this adventure of the two lovers, and then I will come to disturb your tête-à-tête with his majesty." Cinq-Mars read on. Don Cleophas and his fair Matilda descended the staircase in the city walls, but before they reached the gate the alarm was given, and by the time they had mounted their horses all the garrison was alarmed for their pursuit. Flights of arrows followed them from the ramparts as they fled, and a body of horse kept close upon their track. But still Don Cleophas pursued his way, the bridle of Matilda's horse thrown over his arm, and his right hand ready to grasp the sword, should the Moors overtake them. It was up the ascent of a steep hill that he took his way, and at the top he reined in his horse on the edge of the crags which looked down into a peaceful valley below. Don Cleophas sprang to the ground, gave one look to the Moors, who were following fast behind, and as a last resource, catching Matilda in his arms, he leaped from the brink, bounding from rock to rock in the descent, with the agility of an izzard, till at length he reached the deepest part of the valley below. All this was told at full length in the romance. The terrors of Matilda, the daring of the knight, the angry gestures of the Moors, the steepness of the descent, and the calm beauty of the valley, were all dilated upon and described with the utmost minuteness and accuracy, which very much delighted Cinq-Mars, but took him a long time to read, so that just at the moment he had got them safely to near the end of their journey, the door of the king's apartments again opened, and Chavigny passed through the room on his return. Perceiving this to be the case, Cinq-Mars thought that he might as well go on with his book, which he had just begun to do, when Fontrailles entered the saloon and interrupted him. "In the name of heaven, Cinq-Mars," exclaimed he, "what are you about?" "I am waiting till the king is ready," answered the master of the horse composedly, scarcely taking his eyes from the romance. "And is it possible," asked Fontrailles in a tone of angry astonishment, "that you have lain here reading that drivelling book, and suffered Chavigny to be again so long with the king?" "Again?" said Cinq-Mars, becoming more attentive. "He only passed once that I saw." "And ought he have been there once if that were all?" asked Fontrailles. "But let me tell you, Cinq-Mars, he was there last night for more than an hour." "Oh, Cinq-Mars, Cinq-Mars, is this a time when our lives, our fortunes, and our country's weal are at stake, to sit there dozing over a romance, and see our bitterest enemy have access to the king's ear, but too easy to be abused? Depend on it, something more will come of this." "But why did you not let me know," demanded the master of the horse, "that he had seen the king last night?" "I learned it but this moment," replied Fontrailles; "but here comes a page from the king's apartments. A message to you, Cinq-Mars, on my life." The page approached. "I am commanded by the king's majesty to acquaint you, monseigneur," said he, addressing the Grand Écuyer, "that he feels himself too unwell to enjoy the pleasures of the chase to day; but he desires that his indisposition may not prevent you, and the other gentlemen invited, from following your sport." And having delivered this message, the attendant withdrew without waiting for any reply. "Well, now you see, Fontrailles," exclaimed Cinq-Mars, "there is nothing wrong here. Nothing can be more kind and considerate than, when ill himself, to wish us to follow the sport without him." An expression of heavy, deep-seated thought sat upon the brow of the clear-sighted, suspicious Fontrailles. He took 2 or 3 steps up and down the apartment, and then, turning to Cinq-Mars with a countenance in which painful anxiety and bitter irony were strangely mingled, he considered his companion with an attentive glance, which ran rapidly over his tall, elegant figure. "Cinq-Mars," said he, "you are more than 6 feet high, and could spare a few inches of your height upon an occasion. Even were they to make you shorter by the head, you would still be a tall man. As for me, I am short already, and cannot afford to be cut down. A word to the wise: I go to shelter myself from pruning knives. Do as you please. We shall meet in this world or the next. Adieu." And turning on his heel, he quitted the saloon. "The man is mad," said Cinq-Mars aloud as Fontrailles left him, "irretrievably cracked;" and jumping up from the window seat, he descended to the courtyard, called the huntsmen together, mounted his horse, and led the chase as merrily as if nothing had happened but the ordinary trifles of a day. Had he known all, very different would have been his feelings. The visit of Chavigny to the king was one on which the fate of France depended, and the wily statesman had entered the apartments of the monarch, prepared equally to guard every word he uttered himself, and to watch every turn of Louis's irritable and unsteady mind. The king was leaning on a table in his cabinet, dressed for the hunting expedition we have mentioned, and more than an usual degree of peevishness was expressed in his countenance. "Well, sir," exclaimed Louis, as Chavigny entered, "what other bad news have you the pleasure of bringing me? What other friends have turned traitors? What other power is about to invade my dominions? By the Holy Trinity, I never see your face but it makes me melancholy." Chavigny was not sorry to perceive the king's irritability. The night before he had conveyed to him in general terms the news of a private treaty existing between Spain and some that Louis supposed his friends, and had promised to bring him that morning the names of the different parties engaged. He now came to fulfil that promise, and he saw that the former information had been working upon Louis's mind, and raised in it a degree of impatience and anger that would fall heavily on the first object presented to his resentment. Nor did Chavigny doubt that he would easily be able to turn it in the direction that he wished. "My liege," replied he, "when I find your majesty's confidence betrayed, your dominions threatened, and even your person in danger, it is my duty to give your majesty timely warning, although the news be as unpleasant for me to bear as for you to hear. To conceal treason is the part of a traitor, and as one of your majesty's council—" "Well, well, sir," cried Louis, interrupting him, "spare your exculpation. The executioner is doubtless guiltless of the blood he sheds, but it is not a right honourable trade." An angry flush came over Chavigny's countenance, but it quickly subsided, and he replied calmly, "I came here, as your majesty knows, to give you more minute particulars of the information I rendered you yesterday, and to prove to you that some whom you esteem your dearest friends, and some who are your nearest relations, are the veriest traitors in France. The affair for no one can be more unpleasant than for myself, for there are some to whom I wish well, that have in this merited their death. Therefore, sire, if you find it too painful to hear, in the name of heaven, let it rest in silence. I will hie me home and burn the papers I have brought here, and satisfied with having done my duty, only hold myself ready, when the misfortunes which must follow do arrive, to serve your majesty with my hand and heart." And bowing profoundly, Chavigny took a step back, as if about to quit the presence. "Hold, Monsieur de Chavigny," said the king. "You have done your duty, we do not doubt; but unpleasant tidings, sir, are not to be received pleasantly. Were it ourself alone that they aimed at, perhaps we might leave treason to overreach itself; but as the welfare of our kingdom is at stake, we must look the frowning truth in the face, and prepare to punish the guilty, be they who they may, that we may ensure the safety of the innocent." "Louis the Just," said Chavigny, advancing, and using the term which had been bestowed upon the king by the astrologers of the day from his having been born under the sign of Libra. "Louis the Just will not act otherwise than justly, and if I prove not to your majesty's satisfaction that a most dangerous conspiracy is on foot, let your royal indignation fall upon me." "I know not what you call a conspiracy, sir," answered Louis, his mind reverting to the plans of Cinq-Mars, to which, as we have seen, he had given his own sanction only a few nights before, and for the discovery of which he felt as much alarm as if Richelieu possessed the power of punishing him also. "The conspiracy I speak of, sire," rejoined the statesman, "is formed not only to oblige your majesty to change your ministers, but—" "I can conceive no plan for obliging me to change my ministers," interrupted the king. "You must have mistaken Monsieur de Chavigny. Perhaps the persons whom you style conspirators have only in view to make me dutiful petition and remonstrance, in which case I should give their arguments all due weight and consideration. Therefore, if this be the information you bring, I wish to hear no more." Long accustomed to observe every particular point of weakness in the king's mind, Chavigny at once conceived the whole train of Louis's thoughts, and judged from the very alarm which he saw in the monarch's countenance, that if the cardinal's power could once be re-established, it would be more unbounded than ever, and as these ideas passed through his mind, they called a transient smile upon his lip. "Why do you smile, sir?" demanded the king sharply. "Pardon me, sire," answered Chavigny, "but it was, that you should think me so weak as to trouble you upon such a subject. If leaguing with enemies you have fought and conquered, be humble petition; if bringing foreign troops to invade your dominions, be dutiful remonstrance; if promising to deliver the strong palaces of France into the hands of Spain, be loyalty and faith, then I have unnecessarily disturbed your repose." Chavigny's speech worked upon the king as he expected. "How say you?" exclaimed Louis, his eyes flashing fire. "Who has dared to conceive such a thought? Who has had the hardiness to unite himself to Spain, our sworn enemy, our mortal foe? Prove your assertion, sir. Prove that such a traitor exists in our dominions, and were he our own brother, we would doom him to death." Chavigny instantly caught at the idea. "Sorry I am to say, sire," he replied, "that your majesty has but too truly divined the person. The Duke of Orleans, unhappily, is the chief of this dangerous conspiracy. Behold, my liege, his name to this treaty with Spain." And artfully contriving to conceal the greater part of the names with his hand in holding it before the king, he pointed out the great sprawling Gaston, which stood the first on the list of signatures. Louis instantly recognised his brother's handwriting. "Gaston of Orleans! Gaston of Orleans!" he exclaimed. "Will nothing satisfy you? Must you betray your country to her enemies, as well as plot against your brother's life with magicians and astrologers?" We have already had occasion to remark that Louis, deeply imbued with all the superstitions of the age, put full faith in every part of astrology, and dreaded nothing more than the effects of enchantment. Nor could anything free his mind from the idea that his brother had, in former times, conspired against his life, with certain magicians who were actually executed for the crime, or amongst others being the famous Père Le Rouge, whom we have more than once noticed in this sage history. The Duke of Orleans himself escaped with a temporary banishment, but the circumstance still rankled in the king's mind, and at present the anger which might perhaps have turned aside from Cinq-Mars, had Chavigny at first suffered the favourite's name to appear, now burst with full force upon the less favoured Gaston. "Issue a warrant for his instant arrest," exclaimed the king. "By heaven, he shall not escape more than another man." "May it please your majesty," answered Chavigny, "to sign the warrant yourself. This is a case of no simple conspiracy, where the king's brother is at its head, and many of the first in the kingdom its supporters, and the warrants ought not to be simple lettres de cachet of council, but ought to bear the royal signature." "Well, sir," replied the king, "have the warrants prepared, and I will sign them. I am going now to hunt, and at my return we will examine these papers and speak farther." "I have the warrants drawn out here," said the statesman, not choosing to let the first impression subside. "I will not detain your majesty a moment. I felt convinced that you would not allow justice to slumber, and therefore had them prepared. This is against the body of Gaston of France, Duke of Orleans," he continued, looking at one of the papers. "Well, give it to me," exclaimed the king, taking up a pen. "It shall be done at once." Chavigny put the warrant in Louis's hand, and looked at him with intense feeling, and a triumphant smile, as he hastily wrote his signature to it. "Now," thought Chavigny, "I have you, one and all. Now, proud Cinq-Mars and calculating Bouillon, you are in my power. He signs the warrant against his own brother, and he dare not let you escape." And countersigning the warrant, he put a second into the king's hand. "That is against the Duke of Bouillon, sire," and he calmly took up the first and placed it in his portfolio. "The Duke of Bouillon!" exclaimed Louis, with a sudden start, remembering the orders he had sent him, and terrified lest Richelieu should have discovered them. "Is his name to that paper?" "No, sire," answered the statesman, "it is not; but in the treaty itself there is abundant proof of his concurrence, and it was on its way to him in Italy when it was discovered. The same messenger bore it that conveyed to him your orders to march his troops into France." And Chavigny fixed his keen penetrating glance upon the king's countenance. Louis turned away his head and signed the warrant, while Chavigny proceeded to place before him that against Fontrailles, and subsequently one which authorised the arrest of Cinq-Mars. "How!" exclaimed the king. "Here are the first and most loyal men in my kingdom. Monsieur de Chavigny, this is going too far." "Their names, my liege," answered Chavigny, "are affixed to the treasonable treaty in my hand." "It cannot be!" cried Louis, an expression of painful apprehension coming over his countenance. "It cannot be! My faithful, loyal Cinq-Mars is no traitor. I will never believe it." And he threw himself into a seat and covered his eyes with his hands. Chavigny opened the treaty calmly, and briefly recapitulated the principal articles. "The first item is, my liege," he proceeded, "that Spain shall instantly furnish 10,000 men to enter France by the way of Flanders; and for a security to his Catholic Majesty, a second item provides that the Duke of Bouillon shall place in his hands for the time being the Principality of Sedan. A third goes on to arrange that 5 principal fortified towns of France shall be given into the hands of Spain, and the whole concludes with a solemn alliance, offensive and defensive, between the conspirators and the Spanish king. And to this treaty," added he, in a firm, deep tone of voice, "stand the names of Cinq-Mars and Fontrailles." "Cinq-Mars has been deceived, misled, abused," cried the king, with a degree of agitation almost amounting to agony. "That will appear upon his trial, my liege," rejoined Chavigny; and then, wishing rather to soften the hard task he called upon Louis to perform, he added, in a gentler manner, "Your Majesty was born under the sign of Libra, and have always merited the name of just. If anything in extenuation of his fault appear in the case of Monsieur le Grand Écuyer, that can be taken into your merciful consideration after his arrest. But having calmly given an order for the imprisonment of your own royal brother, your Majesty cannot, and will not, show the manifest partiality of letting a person equally culpable escape. May I once more request your Majesty to sign the warrant?" "Well, well," cried Louis, snatching up the pen, "but remember Cinq-Mars must be pardoned. He has been deceived by that treacherous Duke of Bouillon and that oily Fontrailles. Oh, he is all honour and loyalty. Have I not experienced 1,000 instances of his affection? It is false, it is false!" and he dashed down the pen without using it. Chavigny gazed on him for a moment with a feeling very nearly allied to contempt. "Well then, your Majesty," he said at length, "is it your pleasure that I cause the arrest of the Dukes of Orleans and Bouillon, with Monsieur de Fontrailles and others concerned in this conspiracy, and let Monsieur de Cinq-Mars know that Louis the Just makes a distinction between him and other men?" "No, no, Chavigny," replied Louis mournfully. "Give me the paper. I will sign it. But Cinq-Mars must be saved. He has been deceived. I will sign it." And turning away his head, he wrote his name with a trembling hand; but still he continued to hold the warrant, as if unwilling to part with it, repeating more than once in a tone rather of entreaty than command, "Indeed, indeed, Chavigny, he must be saved." "Will your Majesty look at this part of the treaty to see I have stated it correctly?" said the statesman, offering the papers to the king. Louis laid down the warrant to receive them, and Chavigny, instantly raising the order for the arrest of Cinq-Mars from the table, placed it in his portfolio with the rest. Louis saw that it was gone beyond recall, and dropping the treaty from his hands, hid his face in his cloak with feelings near akin to despair. Chavigny's object was gained, and the power of Richelieu re-established. Not only all the conspirators were delivered, bound into his hands, but the king himself was virtually in his power. Too weak, as the statesman well knew, to stand alone, or to choose new ministers for himself, Louis had no resource but to yield himself once more blindly to the guidance of the cardinal. And from the moment he had signed the warrant against Cinq-Mars, Chavigny looked upon him but as a royal tool to work out the designs of that great unshrinking politician, who had already so long used him for his own purposes. The unfortunate monarch also was but too well aware of his own want of energy, and for the unsupported situation in which he had left himself, and yielding to his ancient dread of Richelieu, he charged Chavigny with a multitude of exculpatory messages to the minister, calling him his best friend and his cousin, and adding various civil speeches and professions, which both Chavigny and the cardinal knew how to estimate. "There are many other persons, sire," said the statesman, as he was about to depart, "who are implicated more or less in this unhappy conspiracy; but as their guilt is either in a minor degree, or their rank less elevated, I will not trouble your majesty to put your personal signature to the warrants against them. In the meantime, allow me to hint that the king ought not to be seen hunting with traitors when they are known to be so." "No, no," replied Louis mournfully, "I am in no mood for hunting now. But where go you, Monsieur de Chavigny? You will not leave me for long," added the king, feeling that he must have some one to lean on, and little caring who, so that they yielded him support. "You will not leave me for long in this case of danger." "I am about to proceed to Corneille," replied Chavigny, "to order up a body of the cardinal's guard. At present I have no escort but a few servants. We are surrounded by the retainers of the different conspirators, and were I to attempt the execution of your majesty's warrants, we might meet with opposition. But I will soon set that at rest, and before tomorrow morning there shall be 1,000 men in Narbonne, truly devoted to your majesty's service." The king gave an involuntary shudder, and Chavigny, with a mockery of profound respect, which he felt but little, took leave and quitted the presence. The moment was gone. Louis called to one of the attendants, and carefully shutting the door when he had entered, "François," said he, "you are a silent, cautious man. I can trust you. Go to Monsieur le Grand Écuyer, and, if he is alone, tell him that France is a climate dangerous for his health, to betake himself elsewhere, and that speedily. But if there is any one with him, merely say that the king feels himself too unwell to enjoy the pleasures of the chase today, but that he desires that his indisposition may not prevent the gentlemen invited from following their sport. But, François, watch well Cinq-Mars' return. Find him out alone, and give him the first message. Only beware that in it the king's name is never mentioned. Do you understand?" The page bowed profoundly, but still maintained the same unbroken silence, and retired to fulfil the king's commands. The presence of Fontrailles, however, prevented him from delivering the warning, until the master of the horse returned from hunting, when he found an opportunity of speaking to him alone. Such a caution, delivered by the king's own page, alarmed the favourite; but though it was by this time late, he sent a servant to see if the city gates were shut. The servant scarcely gave himself the trouble to inquire, but returning immediately, informed his master that they were. Cinq-Mars stayed, and before the next morning every avenue from Narbonne was occupied by the cardinal's guard. Chapter 12. Section 37 of Richelieu, A Tale of France, by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. Containing a journey, a discovery, and a strange sight. I have known some persons in the world who, gliding quietly through life, have floated on upon the stream of time, like a boat on the waters of a broad and tranquil river, carried on by the unruffled tide of prosperity, and lighted to their journey's end by the cloudless sun of happiness. And I have met with others whose star seemed to rise in clouds, to hold its course through storms, and to set in blacker darkness than that which gave it birth. But long-continued joy loses its first jest, and uninterrupted sorrow its first poignancy. Habit robs even misery of its acuteness, and care that is long endured brings along with it the power of longer endurance. It is the sudden transition from joy to sorrow that is the acme of human suffering, adding the bitterness of regret for past enjoyment to all the pangs of present distress. It was thus with Claude de Blenau. All his wishes had been nearly fulfilled. Hope had almost grown into certainty. Pauline was almost his own, when he was snatched from the bosom of joy and security to new scenes of misery and danger. The few last hours came back to his memory like one of those bright visions that sometimes visit our slumber, with every part so truly told, so faithfully drawn, that they become too like reality. And then, when our hearts are full of scenes that we have loved, and pleasures that we have lost, the pageant fades, and we find it but a dream. When once he had torn himself from Pauline, the objects round him called forth little of de Blenau's attention, and the carriage in which he was placed rolled on for many leagues before he had sufficiently recovered his tranquillity even to think of the minor points of his situation. The moon, which at their departure shone bright and clear on the broad masses of the forest, had by this time sunk below the horizon. The darkness which had followed her decline had also passed away. The grey streaks of dawn had warmed into the bright blushes of the early morning, and the new risen sun began to look over a dewy world, that awoke sparkling and smiling, as if for joy at his approach. But the scene which at any other time would have called up 1,000 remembrances of the happy days and hunter sports of his youth, scarcely now roused him from the reverie in which he was plunged, and if he looked round or spoke to the person who conducted him, it was merely to ascertain in what direction they were going, or what was the ultimate destination of their journey. Never before had he so completely abandoned himself to despondency. But as a second and third day passed, he began to recover from the first bitterness of his feelings, and endeavoured to draw from the officer the precise crime with which he was charged, and what circumstances of suspicion had arisen against him. But no farther information was to be procured. The officer continued firm in the same story he had told the Queen, that his orders were to conduct him to Tarascon, and that he was quite ignorant of the circumstances which led to his arrest. And with this de Blenau was obliged to be satisfied. During the journey the officer showed much civility and attention to the prisoner, though he took good care to place a guard at the door of his chamber when they stopped for the night, which was always at the house of one of those private agents of the government already mentioned, with whose dwellings the officers of the Cardinal's guard were generally acquainted. After proceeding, however, for several days, he plainly perceived that nothing could be farther from de Blenau's thoughts than any plan for making his escape, and, in consequence, the watch he kept over his prisoner became far less strict, which afforded the Count many opportunities of communicating freely with the persons at the various places where they stopped for horses or refreshments. The arrest of Cinq-Mars and several others, with the full restoration of the Cardinal's power, was at that moment in France one of those topics of wonder and interest which seemed necessary from time to time to keep up the spirits of the gossiping classes of society, and though the good folks at inns and elsewhere found the appearance of a prisoner escorted by a body of the Cardinal's guard to act as a great check upon their natural loquacity, yet, as the officer was somewhat of a bon vivant, and rather attached to his bottle, the awe inspired by his functions was not so strong as to prevent the news of the Grand Écuyer's misfortune from reaching the ears of de Blenau, who easily concluded that, from their well-known intimacy, suspicion had fallen upon himself. The prisoner and his conductors at length began to approach that part of the country where the re-established minister held his court, to which all his old retainers and friends were now flocking, together with many others, who, led by hope or impelled by fear, hastened to offer their servile adulation to a man they in general detested. The roads were thus thronged with people, and many a gay cavalcade passed by the carriage in which de Blenau was borne along. The horsemen looking for a moment into the vehicle out of curiosity, but quickly turning away their eyes again, lest they should be obliged to acknowledge some acquaintance with the person who had fallen under the Cardinal's displeasure. It was night when they arrived at Montolieu, and de Blenau asked his conductor if he intended to stop there till morning. "No, Monsieur le Comte," replied the officer, "we must proceed as speedily as possible to Mirepoix, where I expect orders for my farther conduct." "Then you go to Tarascon in the Pyrenees," said de Blenau. "I thought his eminence was at the city of that name by the banks of the Rhone, opposite Beaucaire." "He was there some time ago," replied the officer, "but he has since gone to the mountains, where doctors say there are waters which have great virtues in sickness like his. For my part, I always thought the springs there very bad, and neither fit for man nor beast, but nevertheless we must hasten on, sir." The next place they stopped was at Cornay, and according to his custom the officer remained with de Blenau in the carriage, while the troopers arranged everything that was necessary for proceeding on their journey. There seemed, however, to be a considerable bustle amongst the men, and after waiting patiently for a few minutes, the officer drew back the curtain, and thrusting his head from the window, inquired the cause of the delay. The answer he received imported that no fresh horses could be procured, and that those which had drawn them so far were incapable of proceeding even to the next town. "How happens it there are no horses?" demanded he impatiently. "There ought always to be horses reserved for the use of the government." To this it was replied that so many people had passed to the court at Tarascon that every horse which could be hired, even at an exorbitant price, had been carried away. The officer paused as if doubting what course to pursue. But there being no remedy, he was obliged to alight in order to pass the night at Cornay, taking care, however, to dispatch one of the troopers to Mirepoix to bring any orders which might be waiting for him in that town. The moon was up, and as de Blenau descended from the carriage, he perceived a little stream dashing and glistening over the wheel of a mill, that stood dark and defined against the moonlight sky. It was to this they were apparently proceeding, and as they approached nearer, there was seen an irregular part of the building projecting from the rest, which seemed appropriated to the particular use of the miller. At the same time, on a wooden staircase, which wound up the outside of the house, appeared a man holding a light, and habited in one of those dusty jackets which have been the insignia of flour grinders from all generations. At the moment I speak of, he was holding a conversation with one of the troopers, and, by his quick articulation and busy gestures, seemed engaged in making remonstrances without any great effect. "What does he say?" exclaimed the officer, who caught a few words of their conversation as he got out of the carriage. "That we cannot stop here the night? Give him a cuff of the head, Julie, to teach him better manners to the cardinal's guard. By heavens, we shall find me horses to-night, or he shall lodge me till to-morrow." "Stay if you will, sir officer," rejoined the miller, raising his voice, "but I tell you that you ought not to stay. And as for laying a finger on me, you know I serve the cardinal as well as you, and you dare not." "Dare not!" cried the officer, who was by this time mounting the stairs, catching the miller by the collar, and striking him a slight blow. "You are a refractory rascal, sir. Open the door of your house, or I will throw you over the staircase. Come, Monsieur de Blenau, follow me." The miller offered no resistance, but threw wide the door, and let the officer pass in. De Blenau came next, having taken little notice of the altercation, but as he went by the miller, who held the door open, he heard him mutter to himself in an under voice, "He shall pay for it with his blood," in a deep, bitter tone of determined hatred, that made the Count turn round, expecting to see the ferocious countenance of an assassin. Nothing, however, could be more different from the appearance of the speaker, who was a smooth, pale-faced man, whose look expressed little besides peaceful tranquillity and patient resignation. The room into which they entered was a large uncouth chamber, filled with various articles of household furniture, the unusual assemblage of which showed that it was used for most of the different purposes of life. There was a bed in one corner, with a large screen, or paravent, half drawn before it. Beside the fire, a row of copper saucepans and cooking utensils. Round about were several saddles and other pieces of horse furniture, and in the centre was a large table with 2 or 3 half-emptied bottles and some glasses, which bore marks of having been recently used, and at the same time a long bench was placed at one side of the table, with 3 single seats on the other. On the opposite side of the apartment was a wooden partition, evidently new, which seemed to separate what had once been one large chamber into 2, with a door of communication between them. "Oh, Monsieur Godefroy!" exclaimed the officer, looking at the table, and then turning a significant glance to the miller, So you have been carousing, and did not like to let us share in your good cheer. But come, we will not be sent away like a dog without his dinner. Let us taste your Burgundy, and if you were to lay 3 of those plump boudins upon the fire, they might savour the wine." "You are very welcome, Sir Officer, to anything the house affords," replied the miller, neither civilly nor sulkily. "Help yourself to the boudin, while I go down for the wine." "They say in my province, Monsieur de Blenau," said the officer, placing a seat for the prisoner near the fire, "qui dort dîne, et qui fait l'amour soupe." Now, as we have neither slept nor dined, and have no one to make love to, let us sup at least. De Blenau's only reply was that he had no appetite, which seemed considerably to surprise the officer, who, as soon as the miller had brought in the wine and his supper was ready, fell to with no small eagerness, and did not leave off till he had transferred the greater part of the trencher's contents to his stomach. The miller seemed more inclined to follow the officer's example than de Blenau, and his anger having apparently subsided, he pressed his guest to continue the meal in so sociable and friendly a manner that de Blenau could scarcely conceive that the words he had heard as he entered had been anything but the effect of momentary irritation. But shortly after he had again cause to alter his opinion. The eagerness with which the miller invited his companion to drink, producing bottle after bottle of different wines, generally denied by their price to persons in his station of life, and the subdued glance of triumph with which he viewed the various stages of intoxication at which the officer gradually arrived, caught de Blenau's attention and excited his suspicion. However, the vengeance which the miller meditated was of a very different nature from that which the Count imagined. Nothing which could by any chance recoil upon himself ever entered his thoughts, and his plan reached no farther than to render the man who had offended him deeply culpable in the eyes of Richelieu, thus calling upon his head that relentless anger which would be much more effectual vengeance than any punishment he could himself inflict. 2 or 3 hours had passed in this manner, during which time the officer had made various efforts to resist the fascination of the bottle, often pushing it away from him, as if resolved not to taste another drop, and then again, as he became heated in conversation, drawing it back and filling his glass with an almost unconscious hand, when the sound of a horse's feet was heard without, and starting up, he declared that it was news from Mirepoix, and staggered towards the door. The moment he had quitted the room, the miller approached de Blenau, glanced his eyes round the chamber, and then addressed him in a whisper. "What a moment," said he, "for a prisoner to make his escape, while that drunkard's senses are confused with wine." De Blenau started at the suddenness of the proposal, and eyed his companion with an inquiring glance. "If you allude to me," he replied at length, "I thank you, but I have no thought of escaping." "You have not?" said the miller, apparently surprised. He thought for a moment, and then added, "Oh, you reckon on your innocence, but let me tell you, Sir Count, that there is both danger and uncomfort in a long imprisonment." "I know it," answered de Blenau, "but I would rather submit to both than cast a suspicion on my honour and my innocence by attempting to fly." This was a sort of reasoning the other did not understand, and his lip curled with a slight expression of contempt, which would have showed itself more visibly had not de Blenau's rank, though a prisoner, kept the bourgeois in awe. He turned away, however, seemingly with the intention of quitting the room, but when he got to the other side he paused, laid his hand upon his brow, and after thinking for a moment, again came back to de Blenau. "I advised you for your own good, Monsieur le Comte," he said, "and though you will not escape from the dangers of accusation, I will give you the means of proving your innocence. In that room," and he pointed to the small door in the partition, "you will discover 2 packets of papers exactly similar. Take either of them, and in that you will find enough to disprove all that your enemies will say against you." "But," said de Blenau, "what right have I to possess myself of papers belonging, probably, to another?" "Pshaw!" cried the miller, "one would think that your neck itched for the axe. Are you not in my house? Do I not bid you to take them? Of course you will not betray me to the government, but take the papers, for I give them to you." and making a sign to de Blenau to use all speed, he went to the door which opened on the road. Before he passed it, however, he turned to the prisoner once more and cautioned him to make no noise, nor regard anything else in the room, but after having taken one of the packets from the table on which they were placed, to quit it as speedily as possible. The precaution, however, was useless, for before de Blenau had even time to determine upon any line of conduct, the officer again entered the room, and balancing himself as well as he could, contrived to arrange at the table after many a zigzag and many a halt. He had precisely reached that pitch of intoxication when a man, having for some time suspected that he is tipsy, finds out that such a supposition was entirely a mistake, and that he never was more sober or more in his senses in his life. Consequently, he had not the slightest objection to drink a bottle of the vin de Saint-Péray, which the miller set before him, although the Burgundy he had already imbibed had very considerably dulled his perception and detracted from his locomotive power. The wine, as it creamed and sparkled in his glass, was raised to his head with increased difficulty at every renewed draught, and at last, feeling something the matter with him, he knew not what, he started from the table, made an effort to reach a chair by the fire, but receiving instantly internal conviction of the impossibility of the attempt, he cast himself upon the bed behind the screen, which happened to be nearer at hand, and in a few minutes all his senses were steeped in oblivion. Immediately the miller raised his hand, pointed to the door in the partition, and left the apartment, as if unwilling to witness what was to follow. De Blenau paused for a moment to reflect on this man's conduct, but however extraordinary it might be, he could see nothing to prevent his possessing himself of papers which, he was assured, would prove his innocence of the crimes with which he was charged, a thing not always easy to the most guiltless. Accordingly, rising from his seat, he passed by the bed where the officer lay snoring in the fullness of ebriety, and opened the door in the partition to which he had been directed. The room with which it communicated was small and dimly lighted by a lamp that stood flickering on a table, as if it scarcely knew whether to go out or not. Near the lamp lay various implements for writing, together with two papers, one folded up and marked, the other open, and seemingly hardly finished. Around were scattered various bassinets and vials, which appeared to contain the medicaments for a sick man, and on one of the chairs was thrown a long sword, together with a poniard and a brace of pistols. De Blenau advanced to the table, and taking up the open paper, ran his eye hastily over its contents. In so doing, his own name met his sight, and forgetting the caution he had received to make speed and quit the apartment as soon as he had possessed himself of it, he could not refrain from reading on. With regard to Monsieur the Count de Blenau, the paper proceeded, the prisoner feels perfectly convinced that he was always ignorant of the treaty and the designs of the conspirators, for Monsieur de Cinq-Mars particularly warned him, the prisoner, never to mention the circumstances before the Count, because he was not to be made acquainted therewith, and, moreover, as de Blenau read, a deep groan came upon his ear, evidently proceeding from someone in the same room with himself, and holding up the lamp, he endeavoured to discover who it was that had uttered it. But, in lifting it suddenly, the feeble light was at once extinguished, and the whole chamber remained in darkness, except where a gleam came through the doorway of the other room. "Godefroy! Godefroy!" exclaimed a faint voice, "do not put out the light. Why have you left me so long? I am dying. I am sure I am dying." "I will bring another light," said the Count, "and be with you instantly." And forgetting, in the hurry of the moment, his peculiar situation, and the caution which ought to have accompanied it, he hastened into the other apartment, where the officer still lay undisturbed in his drunken slumbers, and taking one of the rosine candles from the table, returned to give what succour he could to the person whose faint voice he had heard. On re-entering the chamber with the stronger light which he now brought, his eyes fell upon the drawn curtains of an alcove bed at the farther extremity, and approaching quickly, he pulled them back, shading the candle as well as he could to prevent its glare from offending the eyes of the sick person. But his precaution was in vain. Light and darkness had become the same to the pale inanimate form before him. De Blenau saw that, during the moment of his absence, being had passed away, and holding the light nearer to the bed, he thought he could trace, in the disfigured countenance that lay in ashy paleness upon the pillow, the features of the Grand Écuyer's Italian lute-player, Villagrande. He was engaged in examining them more attentively, when someone silently laid their hand upon his arm, and turning quickly round, he beheld Chavigny, while the countenance of the miller appeared in the doorway, very little less pale than that of the dead man. De Blenau's first impulse was to point to the dead man, while his eyes rested on the countenance of Chavigny, in which a slight degree of agitation showed itself for a moment, and then disappeared. "So," said the statesman, regarding the lifeless body of Villagrande, "he is dead, poor wretch, gone on that uncertain journey which lies before us all, like a land covered with a thick mist, whose paths or whose termination none of us can discover. But to matters of life and moment," he continued, "what do you here, Monsieur de Blenau?" "I should suppose, sir, that you are better acquainted with the object of my journey than I am myself," replied the Count. "You must be well aware it was undertaken against my will." "You have mistaken me, sir," said Chavigny. "The end of your journey hither I am well aware of, but how came you in this chamber? What do you with that paper which is in your hand? I expect a straightforward answer." "Did I give you any, sir," replied de Blenau, "my answer should be straightforward, but you ought to have known me better than so proudly to demand a reply, when you are unentitled to interrogate me. Being a prisoner, I must be guarded as such, though I tell you at once, I have no intention of trying to escape, and being defenceless, you may take these papers from me, though they are material proofs of my innocence. However, I will rely upon your justice, upon your honour, that whatever charges be brought against me, the confession of this man may be opposed to them in my justification." "Monsieur de Blenau," replied Chavigny, "I wish you would sometimes give me an excuse for doubting your sincerity, for then I could see the fate which is like to betide you, without regret. When you were liberated from the Bastille, I told you that the eye of an angry man was upon you, and warned you as a friend to avoid all cause for suspicion. The minister has never forgotten you. You were the first who brought a shadow over his dominion. I hope, therefore, that your innocence can be proved beyond a doubt, for mercy or tenderness between you and the cardinal are out of the question. Nevertheless, I cannot let you keep this paper which belongs to the council, but I will take care that anything which it contains in your favour shall not be lost. In the meanwhile, I shall be obliged to send you to Lyons, and heaven speed you as safely out of this scrape as out of the last." "If perfect innocence of any crime towards the state can save me," said de Blenau, following Chavigny into the outer room, "I have nothing to fear." "I hope it is so," replied the statesman. "And now," he continued, turning to the miller, "let me tell you, Master Godefroy, that you are highly culpable yourself for leaving a state prisoner wholly without guard when you saw the officer in whose custody he was in such a state as this. Make no excuses, sir, it shall be remembered." Chavigny now approached the drunken man and tried to rouse him, but finding it in vain, he called in the sergeant, and writing a few words for his warranty, ordered him to conduct the officer next morning to Tarascon under arrest. "Monsieur de Blenau," he continued, turning to the Count, "you will do me the favour of accompanying me to Montolieu. The horses attached to my carriage are fresher than those which drew you." The promptitude with which Chavigny's orders were given brought all the preparations to a rapid conclusion. A few minutes sufficed him to issue the necessary commands for transferring the baggage which had been brought with de Blenau to the other carriage, and adding a few clear rapid directions to the miller concerning the body of Villagrande, the statesman was ready to accompany de Blenau before he had been a quarter of an hour in the house. At Montolieu, de Blenau was permitted to rest a day, and was then sent forward under a fresh escort to Lyons. The prisoner was now hurried rapidly on his journey, travelling the whole of the first night, and at last only stopping for a few hours to give him some repose at a village about 8 leagues from the city to which he was proceeding. As soon as daylight dawned, they again began their journey, and taking the lower road by the banks of the Rhone, gradually approached the ancient town of Lyons. The first pause they made was a compelled one upon the wooden bridge situated on the river just below the town. This entrance had been chosen to avoid the more populous suburbs, but the conductor of the escort had been mistaken in his calculation, for owing to some circumstances of general interest which drew all the idle and the curious to that spot, the bridge and the alleys to it were entirely covered with dense masses of human beings, which completely obstructed the way. With difficulty the carriage was dragged half over the bridge, and then, notwithstanding the exertions of the guard, it was obliged to stop. De Blenau drew back the leather curtain which obstructed his view, and turning his eyes towards the river, a scene burst upon his sight which at once explained to him the cause of such an assemblage. There was a small but magnificent galley making its way slowly to the landing-place. The rigging was adorned with streamers, the deck glittered with all the splendid apparel of a court. The rowers were clothed in rich uniform, scarcely different from that of the guards which flanked each bank of oars. Gold and jewels and blazonry shone around, but the spot on which all eyes rested was a small canopy of rich embroidery, upheld above the deck on silver poles by 4 officers of the guard, in such a manner as to keep off the rays of the sun, but not impede the breeze of the river from playing around a pile of rich velvet cushions, on which, amidst the pomp and display of a sovereign prince, lay the emaciated form of the Cardinal de Richelieu. His countenance was calm and unmoved. Indeed, he seemed hardly to regard the scene around, listening to the conversation of an abbé, who stood beside him for the sole purpose of amusing him by various tales and anecdotes during the voyage. Sometimes, however, he would raise his eyes, and appear to speak to some of those who stood by, and then his glance would rapidly turn towards a smaller boat, which, attached by 2 long ropes, was towed on at the stern of his own galley. In that boat, seated between 2 of the cardinal's guard, sat the imprudent and unfortunate Cinq-Mars, and his companion in misfortune, de Thou. All the gay gallant spirit of the master of the horse, which once taught him to scoff at the very idea of adversity as at a bugbear of the imagination, was now quelled and lost, and with a bending head and eyes cast down, he sat perfectly motionless like a lifeless but elegant statue. De Thou, on the contrary, calmly surveyed the passing scene. He seemed to have forgot that he was there as a prisoner, born a part of that barbarous triumph which his enemy was enjoying, and even when his glance met that of the cardinal, his countenance remained undisturbed by any emotion of anger or any expression of reproach. I have said that Richelieu would sometimes turn his look towards the boat in which his captives were borne along, and still when he did so, a momentary gleam would lighten in his eyes, and he would hastily glance them round the multitude that lined the shores and the bridge. But there was no sound of gratulation met his ear, no acclamation for his regained ascendancy. The busy whisper of curiosity would stir amongst the people, or perhaps the murmur of compassion as they gazed upon the victims about to be sacrificed to his vengeance. But there was no love to express, and fear changed their curses into the bitterness of silence. Such was the scene in the midst of which de Blenau found himself when the carriage stopped. He had just time to become aware of all its most painful circumstances, when the guards again opened a way through the people, and the vehicle passed on. The high round tower of Pierre-en-Cise, raising its dark mass above the rest of the prison, was the next thing that met his view, and he doubted not that the place of his imprisonment was before him. But the carriage rolled on into the great Place Thérèse, where it suddenly drew up. "Then I am not to be taken to Pierre-en-Cise?" said de Blenau to the officer who had accompanied him from Montolieu. "No, Monsieur le Comte," replied he. "Pierre-en-Cise will be sufficiently occupied with Messieurs Cinq-Mars, de Thou, and others, and when Monsieur de Bouillon and the Duke of Orleans—" "Good God!" exclaimed de Blenau, "is the Duke of Orleans implicated in this unfortunate business?" The officer smiled. "Why, they do say, sir, that the king himself is in the conspiracy, but as to the duke, you know more of his share in it than anyone else, at least so we are told. But I must now beg you to descend." "You are under a mistake, sir," replied de Blenau. "I know nothing of the duke, and as little of the conspiracy. and following the officer he entered a house in the Place Thérèse, which had been changed for the time from one of the public offices of the city into a place of confinement, and offered all the security without the horrors of a prison. The windows were grated, it is true, but they looked out into the free world below, and the captive might sit there and forget that he was denied the power of joining the gay throng that passed along before his eyes in all the pride of liberty. End of chapter 13. Section 38 of Richelieu, A Tale of France by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. Giving a good receipt for proving a man guilty when he is innocent. De Blenau had not been long in his new abode before he learned that the express orders of Chavigny had caused him to be carried thither rather than to Pierre-on-Cise, where his confinement would have been more strict, and he felt grateful for this mark of statesman's consideration. For the first few days, too, he experienced every kind of attention, and was permitted to enjoy all sort of liberty consistent with his safe custody. But this was not destined to endure long, and his imprisonment gradually became more rigorous than that which he had undergone in the Bastille. The use of books and writing materials was denied him, and every means of employing his thoughts seemed studiously withheld. This mode of weakening the mind by leaving it to prey upon itself had its effect even on de Blenau. He became irritable and desponding, and as he received no intimation in regard to the charge against him, he began to conjure up 1,000 vague, unreal images, and to destroy them as soon as raised. After this had continued for some days, he was surprised by the door of his apartment opening one night, at the moment he was about to retire to rest, giving admittance to the corrupt judge Laffemas, and a person habited as one of the greffiers of the court. There are some who are cruel from fear, and some from motives of interest, but few, I trust, who from natural propensity rejoice in the sufferings of a fellow creature. Such, however, was the character of Laffemas, at least if we may believe the histories of the time, and in the present instance he entered the chamber of de Blenau with a countenance which certainly expressed no great unwillingness in the performance of what is always painful when it is a duty. In this place we shall but give a small part of the conversation between de Blenau and the judge, for the course of examination which the latter pursued toward the prisoner was so precisely similar in its nature to that which he followed on a former occasion in the Bastille, that its repetition is unnecessary, especially as our history is now hurrying rapidly to its awful and inevitable conclusion. A part of it, however, may serve to illustrate the charges brought against de Blenau and the circumstances on which they were founded. "Good night, Monsieur de Blenau," said Laffemas, approaching the table at which he sat. "I did not think to meet you again in prison. I had hoped that when last you escaped so well, you would have been careful to keep yourself free from anything of this kind." "Good night, Monsieur le Juge," replied de Blenau. "Do me the favour of sitting down, for I suppose I may do the honours of my chamber, though it be but a prison. I am glad to see you, sir, for I trust you can inform me why I am here confined." "Monsieur de Blenau," said the judge, seating himself, "we will be frank with one another. You are very well aware how deeply you are implicated in this conspiracy, and I will tell you that we have ample proofs of everything. But, at the same time, I know of a way by which you can save yourself, a way which one or two highly honourable men have embraced, having been misled at first by designing persons, but having returned to a sense of duty and honour, and confessed all they knew, together with the names of those they supposed to be amongst the guilty." "I have no doubt, sir," replied the Count, "that all and everything you say is correct and right, but there is one point on which I am in the dark. I am not aware of what conspiracy you mean. I have, it is true, conspired." Laffemas turned an attentive ear, and de Blenau perceived that the greffier, who had followed the judge, was making a note of all that passed. "Stop, gentlemen," said he, nodding to the officer. "Take the whole of my sentence, I beg. You shall have it in plain language. I have, it is true, conspired on more than one occasion with sundry of his Majesty's lieges to kill a fat buck or a lusty boar in various of the royal forests in this kingdom. But this is the only conspiracy of which I have been guilty, and for that I can plead his Majesty's free permission and pardon." "All this is very good, Monsieur le Comte," said Laffemas, his brows darkening, "but I must tell you that it will not serve the purpose you propose. I came here to you as a friend." "As a friend," interrupted de Blenau, "you brought with you that gentleman in black to take down my words, in case I should be at a loss to remember what I had said." "I must once more tell you, sir," said the judge, "that this will not answer your purpose, for a full confession has been made by Monsieur de Cinq-Mars since his condemnation." "Since his condemnation!" exclaimed de Blenau. "Good God, is it possible that he is condemned?" Laffemas was little capable of understanding any of those finer feelings which brighten the dull void of human existence. He read from the black page of his own mind, and fancied that every other word was written in the same dark character. All that he saw in the exclamation of de Blenau was fear for himself, not feeling for his friend, and he replied, "Yes, Monsieur le Comte, he is condemned to lose his head for the crimes of which he has been guilty. The question also formed part of his sentence, but this he has avoided by making a full confession, in which, as you may easily suppose, your name is very fully comprised." "You may as well cease, sir," replied the Count. "It may indeed be true that my unhappy friend is guilty, and has confessed his guilt, but no language you can use will ever persuade me that, knowing my innocence as well he does, he would say anything that could implicate me. I will farther answer everything that can possibly be asked of me in a very few words. As to myself, I have nothing to confess, for I am perfectly guiltless towards the state, and as to others I can give no information, for I am wholly ignorant of any plot, conspiracy, or treason whatsoever." "I am sorry for your obstinacy, Monsieur de Blenau," said Laffemas, rising, "for the cardinal has resolved that you shall confess, and we have the means of making the most stubborn answer. I am, in fact, commanded this very night to use measures which might not be very agreeable to you, but I give you till to-morrow to consider, and so bid you farewell." The plans of Cinq-Mars had run into various ramifications, involving a multitude of persons in a greater or lesser degree, but all fell equally under the hatred of the cardinal, and he spared no means, legal or illegal, to discover the most remote windings of the conspiracy, and to force or induce the various parties to it to make confessions, which were afterwards used as evidence against themselves as well as others. As the proofs against de Blenau were, of course, very defective, the last command of Richelieu to Laffemas before leaving Lyons was to spare no power of intimidation in order to make the prisoner criminate himself, before even granting him the form of a trial. In pursuance of these directions, Laffemas ceased not for some days to torment de Blenau with continual interrogatories, mingled with menaces and irritation, ingeniously calculated either to frighten his victim into some confession of guilt, or to throw him off his guard by rousing his anger. More than once he was carried into the chamber of the question, and once was even bound to the rack. But though in these secret halls of the Bastille Laffemas would not have scrupled to proceed to any act of cruelty, yet at Lyons, amidst people upon whose silence he could not rely, he dared not put the prisoner to the question without some appearance of legal authority. At length, therefore, the day for his trial was fixed, but yet Laffemas prepared to make him previously undergo a species of refined torture, which none but a demon could have devised. Denied all the privileges usually conceded to prisoners, unacquainted with the precise charges to be brought against him, refused all legal assistance, and debarred the use of pen and ink, de Blenau clearly saw that Richelieu had resolved on his destruction, and merely granted him the form of a trial to gloss over his tyranny in the eyes of the people. Nevertheless, he prepared to defend himself as far as possible, and at all events to establish his innocence, for the honour of his good name, though it might not even tend to save him from the injustice with which he was threatened. For this purpose he accurately examined his conduct since his liberation from the Bastille, and noted carefully every circumstance, that he might be enabled to prove the nature of all his occupations so correctly, that the impossibility of his joining in any conspiracy would be made evident. He found, however, that to do this effectually some aid besides that of mere memory would be necessary, and possessing no other means of committing his thoughts to writing, he had recourse to the expedient of pointing some pieces of wood, which he procured from the gaoler, and then, by charring them in the lamp, he was enabled to make notes upon some torn linen preparatory to his trial. Being thus occupied the greater part of the night, his usual time of rest was from daybreak to midday, but one night, a few days previous to the time appointed for his trial, he was disturbed in his occupation by the dull, heavy clang of hammers in the great square before his prison, and proceeding to the window, he endeavoured to ascertain the cause. Through the bars he could perceive various lights and people moving about in different directions, but could not discern in what they were employed, and quitting the casement, he returned to the slow and laborious operation of writing his notes in the manner we have described. At length, wearied out, he threw himself upon his bed, without taking off his clothes, and soon fell into a profound sleep which remained unbroken till late the next day. It is probable that he might have slept still longer, had he not been aroused by his tormentor, Laffemas, who, standing by his bedside with two of his inferior demons, roused him out of the happy forgetfulness into which he had fallen. "Rise, Monsieur de Blenau, rise," said the judge, his eyes gleaming with malicious pleasure. "Rise, here is something in the place which it is necessary you should behold." De Blenau awoke suddenly from his sleep, suffered himself to be conducted to the window, where the judge and his two followers placed themselves behind him, so as to obstruct his retreat, and in a manner to force upon him the sight of what was passing in the place. The square of Terreau was filled with an immense multitude, and there was a deep, awful silence reigned amongst them. All eyes were turned towards a spot exactly opposite the window at which de Blenau stood, where there appeared a high raised scaffold, covered with black cloth, and surrounded by a strong body of troops, who kept the multitude at a distance, without impeding their view of the dreadful scene which was acting before them. A large log of timber lay across the front of the scaffold, and beside it stood a tall, brawny man, leaning on an immense axe, which seemed as if a giant's force would hardly wield it, so ponderous was its form. The Prévost of Lyons, dressed in black and bearing his staff of office, stood on the other side, with several of the civil officers of the city, and a file of pikemen closed each flank of the scaffold, leaving the front open, as we have said, to the view of the spectators. But it was the form of his unhappy friend Cinq-Mars that first riveted de Blenau's attention, and he continued to gaze upon him with painful interest, while, standing beside the block on which he was to suffer, he calmly unloosed his collar and made the executioner cut away the glossy curls of his hair, which otherwise, falling down his neck, might have impeded the blow of the axe. When this was over, Cinq-Mars turned to the good de Thou, who stood beside him, a sharer in his punishment, though not a sharer in his fault. Cinq-Mars appeared to entreat his pardon for some offence, and it is probable that having implicated him at all in the conspiracy was the only circumstance that had weighed upon the mind of the Grand Écuyer. The only reply of de Thou was a warm, affectionate embrace, and then, with the easy dignity of a mind at rest, Cinq-Mars withdrew himself from his arms, and knelt down before the block. De Blenau turned away his head. "You had better observe, Monsieur de Blenau," said Laffemas, "the fate which those two traitors undergo, for such will be your own, if you refuse the hand of mercy held out to you, and persist in obstinate silence. Ah, so much," continued he, looking from the window, "so much for Monsieur de Cinq-Mars. That new fellow is expert. He has the head off at one blow." "Wretch!" exclaimed de Blenau, forcibly passing him, and proceeding from the window. "Unfeeling wretch! Monsieur Laffemas," he added, after pausing a moment, "you are perhaps right in supposing that this torture was superior to any other you could inflict, but I have once more to tell you, sir, that by this or by any other means you will wring from me nothing that can betray my innocence or my honour." "Then die as you deserve," replied Laffemas, and after once more looking from the window and muttering to himself a few words, whose import de Blenau did not catch, he left the apartment with his 2 followers. De Blenau cast himself on the bed, and hiding his face in the clothes, endeavoured to drive from his memory the dreadful scene he had just beheld. But it still continued for many an after hour to hover before his eyes and deprive him of all rest or peace. The hours of a prisoner are always slow, and they were now doubly so to de Blenau, having no other pastime than painful reflections and anticipations equally bitter. At length, however, the day of his trial arrived, and he was conveyed in a carriage to Pierre-en-Cise, where, in the hall of audience, sat 3 of the devoted creatures of Richelieu, presiding over a body equally governed by themselves, and all prepared to pronounce a sentence already dictated by the minister. Although the president of the Parliament of Grenoble nominally directed the business of the court, Laffemas was not absent, and in his eyes de Blenau instantly discerned his fate. The charge made against the prisoner was read by one of the clerks, declaring him to stand in danger of high treason, in having conspired with the Sieurs Cinq-Mars, Fontrailles, de Thou, and others, to bring foreign troops into France, and for having treated and combined with a power at open war with the kingdom for various treasonable and disloyal purposes. The evidence brought forward to establish this was as frivolous as the accusation was unfounded. Even the very semblance of justice was nearly abandoned, the judges seeming to go through the trial as a useless and tiresome ceremony, which might very well be dispensed with. It was proved, indeed, that the prisoner had often been seen in private with the unfortunate Cinq-Mars, and it was also given in evidence by a servant of the Duke of Orleans that he had carried a letter from the prince to de Blenau at Moulins, and that in consequence of that letter, as he conceived, the Duke had gone, with a great air of secrecy, to a particular spot, where he was unaccustomed to ride upon ordinary occasions, and that there he was met by de Blenau. What conversation took place between them he could not tell, but after they had separated, the Duke, he said, gave particular orders that their meeting should be mentioned to no man. The next witness brought forward was the messenger who had carried to de Blenau the king's permission to return to court, and who proved that, instead of finding the count at Moulins or anywhere in the Bourbonnois, to which, according to the king's command, he was bound to confine himself, he had been conducted by the count's page to Troyes in Champagne, where he found Monsieur de Blenau himself ready to set off for some other place. This witness also added that he had learned in the town of Troyes that Monsieur de Blenau had been absent the whole day, during which time he had visited the old castle of Mesnil-Saint-Loup, and that at his return he did not go to the same hotel from which he had proceeded in the morning. When the evidence was gone through, the president of Grenoble signified to the prisoner that he might speak in his own defence, and though well assured that on his judges he could make no impression, de Blenau resolved not to allow the accusation to remain unrepelled, and replied at some length to what had been urged against him. He showed the impossibility of preparing any defence when the nature of the charge had never reached his ears till that day. He pointed out that, though he had known and loved the unhappy Cinq-Mars, their friendship was no proof that he was at all acquainted with the conspiracy for which the other had suffered, and that, though he had met the Duke of Orleans and received a letter from him, that was not sufficient to show him concerned in any plot against the state. He acknowledged that he had left the Bourbonnois without the king's permission, but he stated the powerful motives which had induced him to do so, and gave a correct account, from the notes he had prepared, of every moment of his time since he had been liberated from the Bastille. He farther declared his innocence. He proved that he had been absent from all the principal scenes of the conspiracy, and ended by demanding that the confession of the Italian Villagrande should be produced. The president of Grenoble turned his eyes upon Laffemas, but that worthy judge assumed an air of perfect unconsciousness, and demanded what Italian the prisoner meant. De Blenau now clearly and distinctly stated all he knew concerning him, and again demanded that his confession should be brought forward. But still Laffemas appeared in doubt. "Monsieur de Blenau," said he, "although this seems to me but a manoeuvre to gain time, I have no objections that the paper of this court should be searched, if you can give us the baptismal name of this Italian, of whom at present we know nothing, and even this is a mere matter of grace and favour." De Blenau declared his incapacity to do so, but protested against the unjust proceedings of the court, and showed that, if time and opportunity had been allowed for preparing his defence, he would have been enabled by application to the Count de Chavigny to bring forward the paper he mentioned, and to prove the truth of everything he had asserted by the evidence of persons now at a distance. He was still speaking when Laffemas rose and interrupted him. "Perceiving," said the judge, with unblushing effrontery, "that the prisoner has concluded his defence, I will now occupy the court for a few moments in order to explain the reasoning on which my own opinion is founded, although I see but one conclusion to which anyone can come upon the merits of the case before us. It has been shown that the prisoner was the bosom friend of the traitor who has already suffered for his crimes, that he was in constant communication with almost all the conspirators, and that the royal duke, who has unfortunately dyed his name with so black a spot, at the very same time that he was engaged in plotting the ruin of his country, was in secret correspondence with the individual before us. It has farther been proved that the prisoner, after having been relégué in Bourbon, quitted the place to which he was bound to confine himself, and went upon what he cannot but own himself to be a wild romantic chase, into Champagne. This part of his story is a very strange one, according to his own showing, but when we come to compare it with the confession of the traitor Cinq-Mars, the matter becomes more clear. It was in the old castle of Saint-Lô, near the city of Troy, says the confession, that the principal meeting of the conspirators was held, and it was to this very castle of Saint-Lô that the prisoner directed his course from Moulins. Evidently for the purpose of concealment also, the prisoner, on his return to Troy, instead of directing his course to the inn where he had formerly alighted, proceeded to another, at which, unfortunately for himself, he was overtaken by the king's messenger. I think it is unnecessary to say more upon these points. To my mind they are convincing. It is true, indeed, Monsieur de Blenau has shrewdly kept his handwriting from any paper which could prove him an active member of this conspiracy. But what man in his senses can doubt that he was criminally aware of its existence? This, then, is his crime, and I pronounce the concealment of treason to be as great a crime as treason itself. But if there were wanting a case in point to prove that the law considered it as such, I would cite the condemnation of de Thou, who but 2 days ago suffered with the traitor Cinq-Mars. Let us now, my brethren, he added, retire to consider of our sentence, for I have only spoken thus much, not to bias your opinion, but simply that the prisoner himself, before he leaves the court, may know at least my sentiments. The judges now withdrew to the cabinet appointed for their deliberations, and de Blenau was removed from the court to a small apartment hard by. He had not been here a moment when his page, Henri de la Motte, burst into the room. "My dear, dear master," exclaimed the boy, throwing himself at his feet, "they tell me that you certainly will not be condemned, for that you have not been taken to what is called the dead man's dwelling. So the sentinel let me in to see you." "Henry, how came you hither?" exclaimed de Blenau hurriedly. "But we have no time to think of that. My fate is sealed. I have read it in the triumphant glance of that demon Laffemas. Mark me, my boy, and if ever you loved me, obey me well. When I am dead, near my heart you will find a portrait. Take it with this ring to Mademoiselle de Beaumont. Tell her that the one was the likeness of all I love on earth, and the other the ring that was to have bound her to me for ever. Say that de Blenau sends them to her in death, and that his last thought was of Pauline de Beaumont." "Alas, Mademoiselle de Beaumont," said the page, but as he spoke the door opened, and an officer of the court entered, followed by a priest. "Be gone, boy," said the officer, leading Henry to the door. "How came you in here? We have more serious matters in hand now. "Remember," said de Blenau, holding up his hand impressively, "remember." And Henry, bursting into tears, was hurried from the apartment. "Now, father," continued de Blenau, turning to the priest, "let us to your business." "It is a sad one, my son," he replied. "It is but to tell you that you must prepare to leave a world of sorrow." "God's will be done," said de Blenau. End of chapter 14. Section 39 of Richelieu, A Tale of France, by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Which, if the reader can get through it, will bring him to the end of the history. All delay in the execution of a sentence where there exists no hope of mercy is but needless cruelty. Yet de Blenau was suffered to linger 14 weary nights and days between the day of his condemnation and that appointed for his death. It approached, however, at length. We are told by those who have had the best opportunities of judging that the last night of a condemned prisoner's existence is generally passed in slumber. It was so with de Blenau. Hope and fear were equally things gone by to him. The bitter sentence of death had rung in his ear. He had traced the last lines of affection to her he loved. He had paid the last duties of religion, and fatigued with the strong excitement which his mind had undergone, he threw himself on his couch and fell into that profound sleep which only despair can give and which approaches near to annihilation. He was yet buried in forgetfulness when the gaoler came to announce that the fatal hour was come, and for a moment, even after his spirit had resumed her powers, memory still wandered far from the reality. He had not dreamed, but all thought of the last few months had been obliterated, and remembrance escaping from the painful presence, lingered fondly over all that he had left behind. It lasted not long, and as all the truth came rushing on his mind, he thought alone of his approaching fate, and to meet it as became him. His heart indeed was sick of all the instability of this world's things, and for an instant there was a feeling almost amounting to satisfaction, when he thought that the eternal balancing between hope and fear, between joy and disappointment, was soon to be over, and that his soul, wearied of change and doubt, would quickly have peace and certainty. But then, again, the lingering ties of earth, the fond warm fellowships of human existence came strongly upon him, with all the throng of kindly sympathies that bind us to this world, and made him shrink from the thought of breaking them all at once. This also lasted but a moment. His fate was sealed, and hurrying over all that might in any degree undermine his fortitude, he followed into the courtyard where the Prévost de Lyon and several of the authorities of the town, with a file of soldiers, waited his coming. The distance was so short from the place of his confinement to the scaffold where he had beheld for the last time his unhappy friend Cinq-Mars, that the use of a carriage was dispensed with, and the guard having formed an avenue through the crowd, the gates were thrown open to give him exit for the last time. "Monsieur de Blenau, will you take my arm?" said the Prévost of Lyons. "Mine is a sad office, sir, but the arm is not an unfriendly one." De Blenau, however, declined it with thanks, saying that he needed no support, and with a priest on one hand and the Prévost on the other, he proceeded calmly towards the scaffold and ascended the steps with a firm, unshaken footstep. The block and the axe and the masked executioner were nothing in de Blenau's eyes but the mere weak precursors of the one awful event on which all his thoughts were bent, and for which his mind was now fully prepared. There was but one thought which could at all shake his fortitude. There was but one tie to be broken which wrung his heart to break. He thought of Pauline de Beaumont, but he thought also that he had merited a better fate, and proudly spurning the weakness that strove to grow upon his heart, he resolved to die as he had lived, worthy of her he loved. The very feeling gave new dignity to his air, and he stood erect and firm while the soldiers were disposed about the scaffold, and his sentence was read aloud by the Prévost. A great multitude surrounded the place, and fixed their eyes upon the victim of arbitrary power, as he stood calm and unmoved before them, in the spring of youth and the dignity of conscious innocence. There were few who had not heard of the Count de Blenau, and all that they had heard was good. The heart of man, too, however fallen, has still one spot reserved for the dwelling of compassion, and its very weakness makes it soften to virtue in distress, and often even to forget faults in misfortunes. However that may be, there was a glistening in the eyes of many as they turned their looks towards de Blenau, who, according to the universal custom of the time, advanced to the front of the scaffold to address them. "Good friends," said he, "it is the will of Heaven that here I should give back the spirit which has been lent me. And so help me that God, into whose bright presence I now go, as I am innocent of any crime towards my king and country." A murmur ran among the people. "This is my last asseveration," he continued, "and my last counsel to you is, to keep your hearts clear and guiltless, so that if misfortune should follow any one as it has followed me, he may be able to lay his head upon the block as fearlessly as I do now." And retiring a step, he unloosed his collar and knelt for the stroke of the executioner. "A horse, a horse! A council messenger! Pardon for the Count! Pardon for the Count!" cried 1,000 voices from the crowd. De Blenau looked up. Headlong down the long narrow street that then led in a straight line from the square, his horse in foam, his hat left far behind, and his long grey hair flying in the wind, spurring as if for life, came a horseman, who ever and anon held up a packet in his hand, and vociferated something that was lost in the distance. He wore the dress of a lieutenant of the King's forests, and dashing like lightning through the crowd, that reeled back on every side as he approached, he paused not till he reached the foot of the scaffold, threw himself from his horse, passed unopposed through the guards, rushed up the steps, and Philip the Woodman of Mantes cast himself at de Blenau's feet. "My noble, noble lord!" exclaimed the woodman. It was all that he could utter, for his breath was gone with the rapidity of his progress. "What is all this?" cried the Prevost of Lyons, coming forward. "And why do you stop the execution of the prisoner, Sir Lieutenant? What is all this?" Philip started on his feet. "What is it?" he exclaimed. "Why, that none of you blood-sucking wolves dare put a fang into the Count's throat. That's what it is. There is his pardon, with the King's own signature, ay, and the Cardinal's to boot. At least, so Monsieur de Chavigny tells me, for being no great clerk, I have not read it myself." The Prevost unfolded the paper and read, "Aujourd'hui, etc." Ah, yes, all in form. The King having learned that the crimes of the Sieur Claude de Blenau, Count de Blenau, and Seigneur de Blanfort are not so heavy as at first appeared, and having investigated, etc., has ordained and does ordain, out of his great grace, etc., that the sentence of death be changed and commuted to perpetual banishment, etc., and if after 16 days from the date hereof he be found within the kingdoms of France and Navarre, etc. You understand, Monsieur le Comte. Well, sir, I congratulate you. Here is the King's name, Louis, et plus bas, Richelieu. Will you come and take some refreshment at my poor lodgings?" De Blenau was glad to accept the invitation, for his mind was too much confused to fix upon any plan of action at the moment. His resolution had borne him strongly up at the time when all hope seemed lost, but now the sudden change overpowered him, and amidst the acclamations of the multitude he suffered himself to be conducted in silence to the house of the Prevost, where he was soon after discovered by his page, Henri de la Motte. We shall now pass quickly over the means which he took to procure money for the expenses of the journey before him, merely saying that, through the kindness of the Prevost, he was soon furnished with the necessary funds for proceeding, and accordingly set out from Lyons, the second morning after that the events of which we have described. 2 powerful reasons induced de Blenau to turn his step towards Spain. In the first place, it was much nearer than either Germany or Flanders, which were the only other countries where he could hope for perfect security; and in the next place, his road to the frontier passed not only close to his own estates, but skirted the property of Madame de Beaumont, and he was not without hopes of meeting there some that were the dearest to him of the earth, for he learned from Henri de la Motte that the vengeance of the implacable Richelieu had extended to Pauline and her mother, who had been ordered once more to quit the court of France, as a punishment for having conveyed information to him in the Bastille. Philip the Woodman was not forgotten in de Blenau's new arrangements, and under the pretence of charging him with a letter back to Saint-Germain, in case Madame de Beaumont should not be in Languedoc, the young Count seduced him into a promise of accompanying him to Argentière. His real motive, however, was to recompense the woodman's services on arriving at his own property in a manner which the scanty state of his finances prevented him from doing at Lyons. Notwithstanding all the joy he felt at his deliverance, there was a heaviness hung over de Blenau as he rode out of Lyons, which he could not account for, and a sensation of fatigue which he had never felt before. To shorten the road, he beckoned to the woodman, who, with Henri de la Motte, had dropped a little behind, and made him relate the circumstances which led to his being dispatched with the king's pardon to Lyons. Philip's story, which occupied a long while in telling, may be considerably shortened without disadvantage. It must be remembered that at the time of de Blenau's liberation from the Bastille, Chavigny had promised, as some compensation for all that Philip had suffered by his means, to have him appointed sous-lieutenant of the forest of Mantes, and he kept his word. Philip was placed in the office and exercised its functions, but the actual brevet containing his official appointment had been delayed by a multitude of other affairs pressing for attention, till the statesman's return from Narbonne. At length Philip heard that Chavigny had returned, and that the king with all the ministers was once more at Saint-Germain's, and he ventured to wait upon his patron, as he had been desired, to remind him of expediting the brevet. There were several persons waiting, and in his turn he was shown into the statesman's cabinet. Chavigny had forgotten his face, and asked the simple question, "Who are you?" Such simple questions, however, often produce more important consequences. "I am the woodman," replied Philip, "who was in prison with the Count de Blenau." "The Count de Blenau!" exclaimed Chavigny, while an expression of horror passed over his countenance. "By all the saints, I have forgot. Yet, let me see, to-day is Wednesday. There is yet time. Stay here a moment." And he rushed out of the room, leaving the astonished woodman not knowing at all what he meant. In about a quarter of an hour the statesman returned, breathless with the expedition he had used. "There," he exclaimed, putting a paper into Philip's hand, "there is his pardon, signed by both the king and the cardinal. Away, take the swiftest horse in my stable. Lose not a moment, or you will be too late. Use the king's name for fresh horses, and show that signature. Tell the Count Chavigny has kept his word." "And where am I to go?" demanded Philip quietly, still completely ignorant of the cause of Chavigny's agitation. To Lyons, you fool!" cried Chavigny. "If you use not all speed, the Count's head will be off before you arrive with his pardon." "The Count de Blenau?" demanded Philip. Yes, I tell you," reiterated the statesman. "Your good old friend, the Count de Blenau, so lose no time if you would save his life." Philip lost no time, and arrived at Lyons, as we have seen, just at the critical moment of de Blenau's fate. Though Philip's narrative served to interest de Blenau, and the chattering of Henri de la Motte to amuse him on the way, nevertheless he could not conceal from himself that there was a lassitude gradually growing upon him, which seemed to announce the approach of some serious sickness. Naturally of a strong constitution and an ardent temperament, he never yielded to indisposition, till unable to sustain it any longer; and though fatigue, anxiety, and distress had weakened him much, and his two attendants often hinted that he looked unwell, and required repose, de Blenau would not acknowledge that he was ill until he arrived in the neighbourhood of Tournon. There, however, the powers of nature failed him, and he felt that he could proceed no farther. Scarcely able to sit his horse, he entered the town, and looked eagerly about for some place where he could repose, when suddenly the eyes of Henri de la Motte rested upon the well-known sign of the Sanglier Gourmand, which, as they afterwards found, was still kept by no other person than the celebrated Jacques Chapilleur, who had at last been driven from the neighbourhood of the Bastille by the wrathful governor, for one of his drunken achievements, very similar to the one recounted in our second volume, and had taken refuge in his native place, Tournon. Here de Blenau alighted and was conveyed to a bedchamber, where he was soon attacked by a violent fever, which rapidly increased. Delirium followed, and he quickly lost all remembrance of surrounding objects, though the name of Pauline de Beaumont would often tremble on his tongue, and he fancied that he saw 1,000 airy shapes hovering round his bed, and constantly reminding him of her he loved. In about 20 days the disease had run its course and passed away, leaving him in a state of excessive weakness. But in the meantime the fever, which had nearly destroyed de Blenau, had entirely ruined the unhappy Jacques Chapilleur. The report spread through Tournon that the aubergiste had a malignant sickness raging in his house, and instead of coming thither as usual for the good things of this life, the citizens not only passed his door without entering, but even crossed over the way, as they went through the street, to be as far from possible from the infected air. For some days after he discovered this defection, melancholy preyed upon the unhappy aubergiste, but suddenly he seemed to have taken a bold resolution, pulled down his sign, put by his pots and pans, resumed his gaiety, and no sooner did de Blenau talk of once more proceeding, than Jacques Chapilleur laid before him his sad condition, and prayed, as an act of justice, that he would take him with him into Spain, and suffer him to be his lordship's cook. De Blenau had not the heart to deny him, but another thing came now to be considered. The time which, according to the ordinance of the king, had been allowed him for the purpose of quitting the realm, had long expired, and he was now virtually an outlaw. Every one was called upon to deliver him up as an exile returned without grace, and by law his blood could be required at the hand of no one who shed it. These circumstances, though not very agreeable in themselves, would have given de Blenau but little concern, had not the Judge Laffemas been still in his immediate neighbourhood. But from his vindictive spirit he had everything to fear if discovered within the precincts of France after the allotted time had expired, and in consequence he determined to travel by night as soon as his strength was sufficiently restored, and to effect his escape into Spain with as little delay as possible. Jacques Chapilleur applied himself with all the vigour of an ancien vivandier to re-establish his new lord in his former robust health, and succeeded so well as to leave but little traces of all that fever and anxiety had done upon his frame. In the meantime, Henri de la Motte took care to prepare secretly everything for their departure, and Philip the Woodman, who had somewhat balanced between a wish to return to his family and love for the good young count, determined to follow him to the frontier as soon as he heard that his life was at the mercy of anyone who chose to take it. Under these circumstances, one clear autumn night, towards 12 o'clock, de Blenau sallied forth from the little town of Tournon, accompanied by the somewhat curious escort of the innkeeper, the woodman, and the page, and proceeding silently and cautiously, arrived safely in the neighbourhood of La Voulte, where, betaking themselves to one of the large open fields of the country, the party reposed themselves under the mulberry trees, which by this time had been long stripped both of their green leaves and their silken balls, but which still offered some degree of concealment, and something to which they could attach their horses. At noon, Jacques Chapilleur, as the most expert, was dispatched to the town for some provisions, which commission he executed with great zeal and discretion, and returning, informed de Blenau that he had seen a gentleman in black pass through the town, accompanied by a considerable train habited in the same sad colour. As de Blenau conjectured that this might be Laffemas, it was determined to take additional precautions, and rather to live upon scanty fare than send into any town again, and setting off as soon as it was dark, they passed by Privas and reached the skirts of the thick wood that began about Aubenas, and sweeping round La Gourse, extended almost to Viviers on the one side, and to La Jontière on the other. Near to Viviers lay the estates of the Marchioness de Beaumont, and within a league of Argentière was the Château de Blenau, and it was toward the former that de Blenau bent his steps as soon as the second night had come. Before they had gone far, it began to rain hard, and though the wood afforded some covering, yet the lateness of the season had stripped it of all that could yield any efficient shelter, except at a spot where two evergreen oaks, growing together like twin brothers, spread their still verdant branches over a considerable space of ground. De Blenau was inclined to proceed as quickly as possible, but Jacques Chapilleur, who now acted as body physician as well as cook, so strongly cautioned his lord to avoid the wet, that the whole party betook themselves to the shelter of the oaks, in hopes of the rain passing away. Before them lay a considerable tract of road, upon which, after about half an hour of heavy rain, the moon began to shine once more, and de Blenau was about to proceed, when the sound of horses was heard upon the very path which they had just passed. De Blenau and his party drew back as quietly as possible behind the trees, and though the horses' feet still made some noise, the water dropping from the branches of the forest was enough to cover the sound. Scarcely, however, were they themselves concealed, when a horseman appeared upon the road in a sombre-coloured suit, with some one riding on his right hand, whom de Blenau judged to be an inferior, from the bending position in which he listened to what the other said. 6 servants followed at a little distance, and a straggler brought up the rear, wringing the wet from the skirts of his doublet. One by one they passed slowly by, the uncertain light showing them to be well armed and mounted, but still not shining sufficiently to allow de Blenau the opportunity of considering their features, though he thought that the form of the first rider was in some degree familiar to him. It was not unlike that of Laffemas, yet, as far as he could judge, taller and more erect. The cavalcade passed on, and were seen winding down the road in the moonlight, till they came opposite to a spot where some felled timber and blocks of stone embarrassed the ground. Immediately that they arrived there was a brief flash, the report of a carbine, and one of the horses fell suddenly to the ground. In a moment 9 or 10 horsemen, and 2 or 3 on foot, rushed forth from the wood, and the clashing of steel, the report of pistols, and various cries of wrath or agony came sweeping upon the gale. Were it Laffemas himself, cried de Blenau, this must not be. En avant pour la France! And dashing his rolls into the horse's side, he galloped headlong down the road, followed by the woodman, the page, and the redoubtable Jacques Chapilleur. 2 moments brought them to the scene of the combat, and the moon shining out seemed expressly to light the fray. The one party was evidently to be distinguished by their black habits, the other by their rusty cuirasses and morions. Directly in the way of de Blenau was the cavalier he had marked as he passed, contending with a man of almost gigantic strength, but notwithstanding the superior force of the latter, his antagonist still foiled him by his skilful defence, when suddenly one of the robbers on foot attacked the cavalier also behind. Thus beset, he turned to strike him down, when the tremendous Norman, for it was no other, caught his bridle rein, and urging the horse back, threw him to the ground. The robber on foot shortened the pike he carried to plunge it in his body, but by the time de Blenau's party had come up, and the courageous aubergiste galloping on, bore the point of his long sword in a direct line forward, which, catching the pikeman just below the cuirass, spitted him, to use Jacques Chapilleur's own expression, just like a widgeon. In the meanwhile the Norman had turned upon de Blenau and snapped a pistol at his head, which, however, missed fire. Enraged at his disappointment, he threw the weapon from him, and spurring on his horse, aimed a tremendous blow at the Count, which was instantly parried, and returned by a straightforward lunge that cut him above the eye, and deluged his face in blood. Mad with the pain, and half blinded with the gore, Marteville attempted once more the feat by which he had overthrown his former antagonist, and catching de Blenau's rein, urged his horse back with Herculean strength. In vain the Count spurred him forward. He sank upon his haunches and was floundering in the fall, when de Blenau, finding it inevitable, let go the rein, fixed his knees firm in the saddle, and raising his sword with both hands, discharged it with all his force upon the head of the Norman. The true steel passed clear on, hewed through the iron morion, cleft through hair and skull, and sunk deep into his brain. He reeled in the saddle, his hands let go their grasp, and he fell headlong to the ground, while the horse of de Blenau, suddenly released from the pressure, rose up, and plunging forward, trod him under its feet. De Blenau lost not his presence of mind for a moment, and while his horse was yet in the spring, he aimed a blow at the Gros Saint Nicolas, who had been hurrying to the assistance of his captain, which disabled his shoulder and threw him from his horse. "Sauve-qui-peut!" cried the robber, starting up on his feet and running for the wood. "Sauve-qui-peut! The captain is dead." "Sauve-qui-peut! Sauve-qui-peut!" rang among the robbers, and in a few minutes de Blenau and his party were left masters of the field. The Count drew up his horse, exclaiming, "Do not follow! Do not follow! Let us look to the wounded!" and dismounting, He hurried to assist the fallen cavalier, who was struggling to disengage himself from his horse. "Next to God, sir, I have you to thank," said the stranger, as soon as he had risen. "But is it possible, Monsieur de Blenau?" he exclaimed, as the moonlight gleamed on the countenance of the Count. "God of heaven, I thought you were in Spain long ago." "Monsieur de Chavigny, or I am mistaken," said de Blenau; "but I know that I can trust to your honour, and therefore must say, that though my late illness may have rendered me an outlaw by detaining me in France after my sentence of exile, yet I will not regret it, as it has given me the opportunity of serving the man to whom I am indebted for my life. There, sir, is my hand." Chavigny embraced him warmly. "Let us look to the men who are wounded, Monsieur de Blenau," said he, "and then I will give you a piece of news which, however painful to me, will be satisfactory to you. Cannot someone strike a light that we may examine more carefully what has occurred on this unhappy spot, for I see many on the earth." "It shall be done in the turning of a spit, monseigneur," said Jacques Chapier, who had already collected some dry wood, and who now quickly procured a fire by means of the flint of a pistol. The scene that presented itself was a sad one. On the earth lay two of Chavigny's servants dead, and one desperately wounded. To these was added Henri de la Motte, who had received a severe cut on the head, and was stunned with the blow. Not far from the body of the Norman lay his companion, Caillot, who was the pikeman dispatched by the bellicose aubergiste. In addition to these was a robber, whose head had been nearly severed from his body by the cutlass which was borne by Philip the Woodman, in his capacity of lieutenant of the King's forests, and one so severely wounded by a pistol ball from the hand of Chavigny, that his companions had been obliged to abandon him. From him they learned that the attack upon Chavigny had been preconcerted, that understanding he was bending his steps towards Montpellier, Marteville had obtained exact information of his course, and finding that he must pass through the forest of Viviers, had lain in wait for him with the expectation both of revenge and plunder. "And now, Monsieur de Blenau," said Chavigny, as soon as their investigation ended, "whither does your immediate path lay? You know you can trust me." "I do," said de Blenau. "I go first towards Viviers, to the château of the late Marquis de Beaumont." "And I go there too," said Chavigny. "I am even now expected, for I sent forward a servant to announce my coming." "Indeed!" exclaimed de Blenau. "May I ask your errand?" A faint smile curled Chavigny's lip, which was uncommonly pale. "You will hear on my arrival," said he, "for I see you are ignorant of what has lately taken place, though the couriers must have arrived in all the towns 3 days ago. But let us have our wounded brought along, and we will proceed to the château. It cannot be far distant." The preparations were soon made, the château was soon reached, and Pauline de Beaumont was soon once more clasped in the arms of her lover. But let all that pass. "Madame," said Chavigny, advancing to the Marchioness, "you doubtless wonder as much as Monsieur de Blenau what can have brought me hither. But as I came to Montpellier, I had the King's commands to inform you that the fine which was imposed upon your estates is remitted in full; and to you, Monsieur de Blenau, I have to announce that your banishment is at an end, for his Majesty has given permission to all exiles to return to France, with a very few exceptions, amongst which you are not included. I need not tell you, from these circumstances, that the Cardinal de Richelieu is dead." "Good God!" exclaimed de Blenau, "so soon!" "Even so," replied Chavigny. "Monsieur de Blenau, doubtless you are happy, for he was your enemy; but he was to me a friend, he was nearly a father, and I mourn for him." "May he rest in peace," said de Blenau. "He was a great man. May he rest in peace." Little more remains to be said, for this long history draws towards its close. The sorrows, the dangers, and the difficulties which had so long surrounded de Blenau and Pauline had now passed away like the storms of a summer day, that overcloud the morning, but leave the evening calm and fair. They were united in the beautiful valleys of Languedoc, and in the fair scenes where they had first met. They continued to live on in happiness and love till the hand of time led them gently to the grave. That generation and its events have passed away, but there still remains one record of the hero of this tale, for in a little village church between Argentière and Viviers stands a fine marble tomb with the figure of a knight sculptured in a recumbent posture. Underneath is engraven the date 1685, with the simple inscription, Sigil Claude, Comte de Blunau. End of chapter 15. End of Richelieu, A Tale of France, by George Payne Rainsford James. Read by Lynne Thompson, Tucson, Arizona, 2024.